Recording in progress.
Good morning. Welcome to the Thursday, February 15th, 2024 meeting of the Architecture Review Board. Can we have a roll call, please?
Chair Balte,
Present.
Vice Chair Rosenberg.
Present.
Board Member Adcock.
Present.
Board Member Chen.
Present.
Board Member Hirsch.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Next item is public comment. Is there any members of the public? Are there any members of the public who wish to address us on any item not on our agenda today? Clerk, do we have anyone?
No raised hands on Zoom or speaker cards.
Okay, thank you very much. Next item is agenda changes, additions, and deletions. Staff, could you take us through that, please?
None today.
None today, okay. I would like to request that we agendize, not agendize, but list at the end of our meeting, at the next meeting, where it's under board member questions, comments, and agendas. Board Member Hirsch would like to make a statement regarding SB9 policies, and I'd like to allow him the time to do that. I would like to have that just listed at the end under board member comments. Item 1 is a comment by Board Hirsch.
Yes,
There'll be no discussion or feedback on that, but we'd like to allow him time to.
I'm happy to do that.
Thank you very much. So at next meeting, or if Board Member Hirsch wants to change that date, we can do that, right?
It would be the 3/7 hearing.
I'd like to do that as soon as we could, but at his convenience.
To do it, not now, but at the end of the meeting?
It'll
No,
be
at the end of the
it'll be at
next
the end
meeting,
of an upcoming
agenda.
meeting.
Huh? I'm sorry.
It will be at the end of an upcoming meeting.
Okay.
So the
All right,
next
fine.
3/7 meeting, we'll put it on the
Okay.
agenda.
Okay, thank you.
And then I wanted to ask about reports back from our ad hoc committee on the townhouse project. I don't know if this is the right time to fit this in our meeting, though.
Not yet, if I might comment. We haven't had a chance to work on that.
You've had plenty of chance to work on it. It's been 2 months now. Okay, I'd like to set that up within the next meeting or two that we have to have a report back. So I'll communicate with the two of you offline, but it's an important topic.
I
Yeah,
was
no.
actually going to ask today if we wanted to try and put that on the 3/7 agenda. I think we could make time for that.
Can we be ready to have a report back from our subcommittee? That's board members Hirsch
We'll
and
work on
Chen.
it. Yeah,
This would be objective standards for
townhomes.
making some modifications to the existing
right.
objective standards to,
I would like very
accommodate
much to get that
townhomes.
on the agenda then,
Yeah.
if we can get a commitment from our subcommittee.
yes.
You're shaking your head, yes or no? Sure. Yes, yes,
We can do it.
we can do it, great. And again, there's no need for a staff to put effort into that. The goal is to get our subcommittee to report back to us.
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, then moving on to the next item, city official reports. Staff,
Yeah, so just a couple upcoming items. Board Member Rosenberg will be absent on 3/7, and Chair Hirsch will be absent on 3/21.
you mean Chair Balte, right?
Say that again?
I'm the one who's going to be absent.
And
Yeah, Chair
apologies, I
Bal-
think those dates are flipped.
Oh, I'm sorry, wait. I said Chair Balte will be absent on 3/21,
Correct.
and Vice Chair Rosenberg will be absent on 3/7.
Correct.
Right, okay, that's what I thought. And so if you do plan to be absent, please let me know. We want to make sure we have a quorum for these upcoming items. As you guys know, we have an upcoming retreat, and so that will be on February 29th. We are planning to start at 9 a.m. that day and expecting it to go until about 1 o'clock that day. We have a number of items planned as part of that retreat, including some trainings from our attorney's office and a few other items. We will bring in lunch that day for you guys. And
And where will be the location of the meeting?
yes, it will be in the community meeting room, which is the glass room on the ground floor of City Hall. And upcoming items, March 7th, We have two tentative housing projects, but it's possible that one of those will move out to the 321. That's why I'm thinking it would be a good time for the ad hoc to report out instead of one of those projects if we can. And then new projects that were filed. Let's see.
And apologies to interject here, Claire. I actually just got notification that I will not be missing the 3-7, so I will be
Oh.
here for that one.
Great, okay, perfect, thank you.
Apologies.
Speed of light.
So we do have one new preliminary review item. This is a new townhome development project at 4335 and 4345 El Camino Real. That's basically right on the border of Mountain View and El Camino Real. They're proposing to redevelop the two parcels with a 28-unit multifamily townhome style. This is a Summerhill Homes project. I think that's the only new project. We are expecting, I just want to give you a heads up, Buena Vista Mobile Home is going to be coming in this week, filing a formal application. So you'll expect to see that on the next agenda. We are planning on taking that to an early hearing with council to get some early preliminary feedback, because there are components that will bring that project forward to council, including a regulatory agreement and other aspects of the project.
I've read about it in the paper, but could you tell us what the scope of the project is, roughly speaking? I know it's not been formally admitted, but informally.
Informally, it's they plan to split the lot. They will have a 44-unit mobile home project that gets processed through HCD. And there will be a 61-unit apartment project that's 100% affordable that will be processed through the city. So a total of 105 units.
How many mobile homes are there now? Do you know? I'm sorry to ask you these questions, but
I believe,
just trying to understand what the intensity of this.
I believe it's around 80 or so right now.
Okay, good. So I will want to assign an ad hoc committee to that. I guess when it comes in, we'll do that. So maybe at the
Yes.
next meeting.
Okay.
And I would like to assign an ad hoc committee to this project on El Camino Real. Seems like it's 28 units of new housing. So I'd like to get two of us again, just tracking that project. Before we do that, I'd like to report to the board that I assigned, refresh my memory, Claire, it was board members Rosenberg to the ad hoc committee for the school at 1066 East Meadow. Was board members
Yes.
Rosenberg and ad hoc, I believe, right?
Yeah, so I haven't had a chance to ask ad hoc formally, but
that's embarrassing.
we'd like
Was
to
there-
ask if you could be on the ad hoc committee for the 1066 East Meadow project. Okay.
Yes, count me in. Thank you.
And we did have a discussion that week. This came in as a preliminary review. And they don't have a formal project on file yet. So the ad hoc committee would be available to meet with staff and the applicant if they want to bounce some ideas on the redesign off of us, and to give some kind of early feedback. We'll make sure that we track everything that is being said so that it can be disclosed in that first hearing, presuming they come back with a formal.
Yeah, we'll be discussing the role of these ad hocs at our retreat, but board members Rosenberg and Adcock, you may want to speak with Claire offline to get a better sense of exactly what we're looking for. I've covered this with Claire, but don't want to do it now. Then to this project on El Camino 4335. I'd like to have two of us assigned to that ad hoc. Do I have any volunteers for that? Board member Hirsch, does that appeal to you? Yeah. Anyone else volunteering? And I'll put my name on the list, please. Hirsch and Volte, please. Okay, and I think we're done with this complicated topic and can move on to our first study session, right?
Yes, yeah.
So today we have two study sessions. The first one is a study session to provide feedback on the parameters and concepts set forth for the parklet prototype options and to provide input on the recommended outreach strategy and timeline for the parklet prototype design process. So we have a staff report on that, or
Yes. Hold on one second. I'm just getting it up and running. And I'd like to introduce, we have Ashwini Kantak from our city manager's office with us today,
wonderful.
and Hannah Chan Smith from Urban Planning Partners, who will be working on this project. And hold on one second, I'll share this presentation with you guys. Sorry, we had a few technical difficulties this morning, so.
To my colleagues, I believe we're going to be looking for an ad hoc committee on this topic as well at the end of the meeting. So just keep in mind if it's something that appeals to you again, or that you think you can contribute.
Good morning, members of the board. Ashwini Kantak with the City Manager's Office. So the purpose of today's study session for the Parklet program is really to talk about a proposed approach for the Parklet prototype design, to discuss the overall timeline for the ongoing Parklet program, and also to review our stakeholder outreach strategy with you. So as you're aware, Council has adopted Parklet program standards, which was slated to actually go into effect April 1st. With the effort related to the parklet prototypes, as well as some prior scheduled work, street repaving work on Emerson. Staff will be recommending deferring the enforcement from April 1st to July 1st. And what that'll do is it'll allow the restaurants to take advantage of the prototypes, which will be made available along with approved shop drawings, as well as a user guide. So our hope is that the restaurants are going to be able to benefit from both an expedited review process with the prototypes and also save on design costs. So they don't have to hire their own designers and structural engineers, and it will also provide some consistency in terms of aesthetics. And so Hannah is going to walk through the rest of the presentation, and then we do have some specific questions we'd like to get your feedback on today. And at the end of the presentation, we'd also like to know if you'd want to establish an ad hoc committee for this. Thank you.
All right. So as many of us know, the city expanded outdoor dining opportunities in 2020 in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and implemented a pilot parklet program in the University Avenue downtown and California Avenue Business District. The program allowed many businesses to remain open throughout that time and has been widely popular by both businesses and residents. At this time, there are approximately 33 parklets. Actually, I have an updated number following a site visit recently. There's about 27 parklets currently constructed in Palo Alto. So as I mentioned, in 2020 was the start of the program. In 2021, council directed staff to develop a permanent parklet program with input with the Architectural Review Board. And a quick note on terminology, the permanent program, the word permanent is really used to distinguish between the pilot program and its standards and the permanent program standards, but parklets themselves are not necessarily permanent, and they're intended to be designed to be removed if needed. And throughout 2021 and 2023, staff worked with the ARB and returned to council numerous times to receive direction on program elements, including fire safety, the use of heaters, parklet size, letters of consent. As Ashwini mentioned, on September 11th in 2023, council adopted the permanent program standards and fees and directed staff to work with the ARB to create pre-approved parklet designs. The full history of the parklet program is available in attachment B if needed. Just to quickly review the scope and location of the program, parklets are permitted in the University Avenue downtown and California Avenue Business District. The full maps are in attachment D. The program does include the car-free streets portion of Ramona Street. However, the car-free portion of California Avenue is not currently part of the program at this time. So the project objectives for the parklet prototype work that we are starting now is to, one, create pre-approved parklet designs that reflect the Palo Alto brand and will allow Palo Alto businesses to undergo a more streamlined approval process. And two, to create a user-friendly guide to reflect the designs and process that business owners can utilize. The project scope includes a feasibility analysis of existing parklets, and I'll discuss that a little bit more in a couple slides. And to create 3 design concepts, so 2 parklet options that have roofs, so essentially 2 different types of roofs that a parklet could utilize, and then 1 option without a roof, should a parklet choose not to have one. And the prototypes will look at wood component options and steel component options. Part of this being available to a wide array of businesses and parklets, the program will include modular parklet components or kit of parts that can be assembled in different variations and in different sizes to meet the needs of each individual business. And then with that, as we mentioned, a user guide will be available. So each prototype concept will include a kit of parts, including modular designs for each component, including a platform, the flooring, the enclosure, sidewalls, and the posts and roof. There may be some repetition in the components across the 3 concepts, but the concepts are really to emphasize that there are multiple roof options and a not roof option. Upon initial discussions with the consultant architects and engineers, the recommendation is for the platform to only be available in a light gauge steel option, and that's for wear and tear and durability to allow these to sustain multiple years in weather. The guide itself, actually, I'm going to go back a minute. So in council's direction in September, it was mentioned, they provided the Beverly Hills parklet example, and that's kind of the inspiration for this project. So on this page, you can see some excerpts from their design guide showing the kind of modular concept and their kit of parts kind of designed and compiled together. And in the next slide, there's an example from the Beverly Hills guide that shows what a page might look like in the user guide itself to kind of outline what the component is. So the description of the section that you're in, a diagram of what the parklet might look like with that component, the required standards, optional standards, and the kit of parts. So that part at the bottom shows kind of the variation of designs for a planter in the Beverly Hills example. There are a number of stakeholders for this project, including the Architectural Review Board, property owners, business owners, the Palo Alto community, restaurateurs, and city council. And throughout the process and the development of the prototypes, we plan to seek input from the ARB and business stakeholders. This slide highlights the outreach timeline. I'm going to jump ahead to the next slide, which has the overall timeline, including the outreach timeline. So the timeline starts today with receiving initial feedback and ideas on the parklet concepts from members of the ARB, followed by an ARB ad hoc meeting, should you choose to create one, and to at that time to review draft parklet components, designs, and materials, followed by a meeting with businesses and stakeholders in the community to receive feedback on those draft concepts. In May, we plan to return to the ARB with draft prototypes and the draft guide to receive a final round of feedback before finalizing the prototypes and guide and return to council in June. As mentioned, there were numerous changes that happened between the permanent program and the pilot program, including standards, changes to setbacks, drainage requirements, the enclosure, size of parklets. And as a result, it's expected that nearly all existing parklets will require some level of modification in order to comply with the permanent standards. And so as part of this, the kickoff of this project, we have conducted a feasibility study on the current parklet siting to estimate how many parklets, if any, would not be feasible based on the new setback standards. And that will help inform, if any, if the city needs to revisit any standards. Some other considerations as we embark on this project are heaters. Propane heaters are permitted under the permanent program with a hazmat permit. And the requirements of the hazmat permit may ultimately decide if a restaurant can use them. Requirements for a hazmat permit include that they cannot be used under roofs, canopies, or tents. They must be a minimum of 5 feet away from any flammable materials, and they cannot be stored indoor or in the public right of way. The standards are fleshed out further in Table 1 of the staff report. Electric heaters are also permitted under the permanent program and provide an alternate option for those who cannot feasibly use propane heaters. However, in order to utilize electric heaters, a panel upgrade may be required. And the differences, this kind of summary and differences between the propane and electric heater options is included on Table 1 of the staff report.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. So the next slide. So here's some questions we're seeking your input on. So just feedback on the overall proposed approach or anything you'd like us to take into consideration. Are there any materials that you would want us to look at specifically? If there's any examples you'd like us to look at, and that relates to all of the components, the enclosure, flooring, roof, structure, and sidewalls. And then also, do you have any feedback on the stakeholder outreach, kind of the universe of stakeholders, as well as the strategy and timeline? So we look forward to your feedback on this. And then also, if we could get direction on potential ad hoc, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Your answers to question 1, 2, and 3 will be yes. And we'll have more forthcoming. Before we do that, I'd like to see if we have any members of the public who want to speak on this. Do we have anyone waiting?
I have no public comments.
Okay, then bringing it back to the board. Do we have any questions for the staff on the presentation?
Sorry, someone just raised their hand.
Oh,
on
wonderful.
Zoom. 1 second. It's Karen Holman. You have 3 minutes. You can unmute yourself.
Good morning, and I appreciate the work that's being done on this. There does need to be some standardization or rather haphazard designs so far have not been particularly appealing to the broader public. I've not weighed in on this at all at any time, but I have had in my line of sight one particular area that's of concern to me that I think we're missing a great opportunity to create a real sense of place, a wonderful environment. And that's the Ramona Street Historic District. That block is, or the historic part of that block is listed on the National Register. And you all know the term sense of place. That does have a sense of place. And I hope that there will be specific standards that will be set forth for that area. For instance, given the architecture, the colonial Spanish colonial revival style, the colonial Monterey colonial, however one refers to it, designed by Clerk and Pedro de Lemos, iron railings would be a very appropriate material for that area. When I've been there at times, it's like the height and coverings. I could have been in Nevada rather than a Clark National Register district. By all rights, we should be proud of that area, very proud of it. It is, again, listed on the National Register. The comp plan calls out support for and encouragement of historic preservation, but the city doesn't do much to encourage appreciation of our resources, and we have many. For instance, like furniture, what furniture, what colors, lighting, etc. Someone told me that they were looking at plastic Adirondacks for that block, for their location in that block. It's like, that's just not appropriate. Anyway, I really urge your attention and consideration of creating a real sense of place in this very special location. Again, lighting, colors, materials. It's not just another location on Middlefield Road or even on University Avenue. It's a very special place, and let's make it special. Let's take advantage of the resources and possibilities that exist. It may be that you want to send it to the HRB for consideration, but I think you all are capable of coming up with some really sensitive design criteria for that very special place. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. Anyone else, please?
No, just the one.
Thank you. We'll bring it back to the board then. We were going to go through a round of questions. Board Member Rosenberg, go ahead.
Thank you. And I appreciate your presentation. That was extremely informative. A couple questions, I guess, about the process. So in comparison to the sort of Beverly Hills outline that you guys had shown as an example, how far along are you guys with sort of preparing that document? What stage are you guys at?
We're at the very beginning.
Okay, not a
Yes.
problem. Just wanted to see if there was actual documentation that you guys had for us to review, or if we're really just getting into the starting of it.
We're just getting started, and we wanted to get your feedback to help us kick things off.
Excellent. Okay. And then I guess my second question is really in regards to the people who already have the parklets, right? The people that were hit hard during COVID, that they really had to sort of clamber these things together at the last minute. A lot of people have put a lot of time, attention, and effort and money into these. And so the question would be, is there going to be a separate path? And you had sort of touched on it lightly about how to make sort of the existing parklets that have been there for maybe even up to 4 years at this point, how to make sure that they're compliant. Is there going to be any sort of specific pathing for those people versus someone building a new parklet?
I'll take that. Thank you for the question. So as Hannah mentioned, with the adopted standards, many of the parklets are going to have to make modifications. If there's existing parklets that pretty much meet the adopted standards and have to tweak slightly, then they can go ahead and do that. But we're anticipating, with all of the different clearances required for safety reasons, they're going to have to take down their existing parklets and build new ones, which is why, again, having these pre-approved prototypes will be helpful to help them save on costs and, kind of build something quickly without a long review period.
Sure. Is there going to be a process for someone who, for example, when someone goes through new, they have the option to go through the pre-approved process, or they can take the time to push it through the city sort of the hard way, for lack of a better way to say that. For some of these people who have an existing parklet, will they be able to route it through and say, we'd like to get this retroactively approved the hard way, right? Is that going to be an option for them? Are they really going to have to comply with the new standards?
I think it's going to depend on what they need to change. Like if they need to take it all down and rebuild,
Right.
then they're going to have to go through the review process, right? They'll have to submit structural calcs, submit all the design drawings. And again, if they go the prototype route, then that we anticipate that'll be quick. So when Hannah mentioned after council consideration between over June and July, we're hoping to get them all pre-approved. And so then they'll be made available, and it would just be a few days of review. That's how we're anticipating rolling it out. So I think it's just going to depend case by case on how many changes. Like if it's an existing parklet that really needs to make very minor modifications, they could go through a pretty expedited process as well.
Excellent. And do you guys have any sort of proposed timeline for the requirement of compliance? So once
Yes.
this program gets launched, how quickly will these existing parklets need to be in compliance?
Yeah, so there's a lot of factors kind of, what we want to do is make sure that we're aligning everything, the enforcement of the new standards, the street repaving, the availability of these design prototypes. So staff is bringing something forward to council, recommending deferral of the program from April 1st to July 1st. If council approves that, we're also proposing kind of a phased enforcement, which will allow people time to take it down, but also allow them time to take advantage of the summer months for outdoor dining.
Excellent.
So they're not like taking it down, when
Right,
they're busy
right,
time.
in the middle of it.
So,
Okay.
yes.
Can I
Alright,
follow
thank
up
you.
on that?
Please.
Kendra?
I'm all done, so
Um,
thank you.
I'd just like to follow up on the fact that it seems most existing parklets will be non-compliant. Why is that? Is that because of the required setbacks or the design style or the construction? Can you give us some idea of, that's a strong statement to say that they're all not going to be non-compliant.
Yeah,
Why?
which is actually why we're doing the feasibility study. The feasibility study is more related to the siting, because now there's many defined clearances, whether it's from vehicular traffic, other parklets, parking, the travel lanes. So that wasn't in place when the parklets were built. And so we want to make sure also distance from utilities, fire hydrants, things like that. And so through the feasibility analysis, we'll be able to kind of, which is also kind of underway, not done yet, we'll be able to figure out if there's major constraints for siting. And that may need looking at those standards again. And Hannah, you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll just add that the changes that we anticipate will result in the most need for changes are drainage, and none of the parklets currently have the drainage requirements that are under in the permanent program. We don't anticipate that to be a change that requires a tear down per se. A modification could be made to implement that, but there's also safety and access standards included in setbacks between parklets and setbacks to allow for fire access to the buildings.
I recall when we went through the initial program back at the tail end of the pandemic, we did address these issues at some length, the safety, the fire access, things like that. And we created standards for merchants, restaurateurs to follow. What you're saying now is that those standards are going to change possibly to be more stringent perhaps?
Do you mean the pilot program or the permanent program?
I believe the ARB worked on the pilot program. It was
The
about
pilot program.
about 3 years ago.
No.
But it was,
Oh, did we?
I'm not aware.
I
of
thought the
that.
ARB worked on the permanent program.
maybe
I'm
it was
pretty
the,
sure. Yeah.
I remember spending 2 or 3 hearings and coming up with quite detailed
I believe that was
specific
for the
regulations,
permanent program.
incorporating things like
Yeah.
safety. We talked quite a bit about how far should it be from a car that's parking, things like that.
Yes.
What I'm driving towards is this. It seems to me that merchants took that information and worked with it. And if we now say, well, it's actually 6 feet, not 4 feet, that's a heavy burden to a restaurant.
So those standards that we worked on with the ARB many years ago actually have not been implemented yet. So those are the permanent standards. Those are reflected in the permanent
see.
standards
Okay.
that were adopted in September. And now we will suggest a phased approach. So those setbacks have not actually been implemented yet.
And I
Wonderful.
think if I'm hearing correctly, they're proposing whether it needs to go the other way, if maybe I'm misunderstanding, but they're wondering if it's too strict. And if it's too strict, is there a way to change it without compromising safety? Is the question that the feasibility study is answering.
Well, I think our board is going to be concerned if if our new standard makes every one of these non-compliant, that seems draconian. And many of them are quite nice and quite serviceable. And so I'd like to be able to try to keep that in
Yes,
place.
and I think that's why the feasibility analysis is really important because we
Good.
don't want to create hardships. I mean, everybody wants
Absolutely.
this to happen. So we'll look at that and bring forward any considerations. If it's precluding many of the existing ones from rebuilding or citing.
Okay, any other questions, Board Member Chen? Go ahead.
Do you mind to share the timeline of the feasibility study? Is it already started and when will it completed?
Feasibility study.
It's underway. It's nearly complete. The city should kind of get an initial draft this week to review. So it's underway already.
And another question is, I noticed the parklet allows to extend in front of the adjacent neighbors. So I'm wondering, and the permit will be renewed annually, right? So I'm wondering what if during the year, the business owner got changed over within the year, then what will happen? Say the adjacent neighbor also want to take the space, then do they require to reduce their size and also redesign the parklet?
Yes. I need to double check the exact nuance. If it's at the annual, I think it's at the annual renewal point that if a neighboring business would like to utilize the space in front of their business, they can request to do that, and then they'll have priority over the space in front of their storefront, and the adjacent business would have to modify their parklet to accommodate.
We can get back to you on that, but I believe there are provisions in the standards. If there is a change in businesses and they wish to use the space in front of their street frontage, then there's a process, like within a certain time, they can ask for the parklet to be, or at least the portion of the parklet in front of them to be removed. So I believe it's 90 days, but we'll confirm that. It's laid out in the standards.
I have two follow-up questions as well. I'll kind of start with the neighbor business part. So if the permit is good for 1 year, and depending on a variety of reasons, it may or may not have the neighbor's consent required, right? The roof and all of that on your report. So if there is a consent from the next door neighbor, then I assume that's also good for a year. So that if they want to revoke that, it would still, I would think, apply for a year at least, right? Not give a 90-day notice saying, oops, I want to use the space now. Is that
right?
correct?
But I think if there's a change in business,
Mhm.
then I think there's some provisions for allowing the new business to request if somebody else moves in there. But again, I don't want to misspeak,
Yeah.
so let us get back to you on the rules for consent.
Yeah, I think clarification on if there's change of next door
Right.
business,
Sure.
is the consent immediately invalid? Because that could be problematic for them.
Right. There is a period of time, but we'll get back to you.
Yeah.
with that.
And regarding my next question is regarding the existing parklet, kind of like how it's already been discussed. I think having a process for somehow grandfathering in existing ones, I know it's only been a few years, but it's a huge cost to those businesses who are working on slim margins to say you got to demo this and start over. So probably I would recommend having some kind of guidelines. If it's strictly safety related, like if they don't have the 2 feet setback, they're
Right.
down, right on the travel lane. That's something versus,
Right.
the 8 feet between parklets. If it's 6 feet, there should be kind of or I guess categories of why somebody needs to take it down, and be more lenient on items that are not strictly safety related. That's a question, comment, recommendation. I have a few other questions. Can I? So regarding the concepts, it looks like the Beverly Hills one is purely kit of parts, not saying 3 options like you're recommending having two options and then a third without roof. Is there a reason why Palo Alto is kind of leaning towards having three kind of options versus fully a kit of parts model?
So if I understand the question correctly, board member, you're saying don't have why are we having a prototype versus just they can just pick from a menu of parts?
Yeah, it seems like it's more, work is not the right term, to kind of set up those three bundles versus your flooring can be this, your planters can be, you know, 6 options, 10 options. Roof can be its own. Instead of saying you have A, B, or C.
Right.
And then within A, B, and C, you would again have toggles, right, to allow different kinds. It seems like there'd be a longer menu of options than to just have kit of parts for each item. That's my question.
Yeah, and I think we'll need to speak to Public Works staff about this because the objective is to have approved shop drawings, right? So we envisioned kind of having 3 different prototypes, actually 6, like because you have it in wood and steel.
Mhm.
So having those go through the approval process. So I'm not sure if we could actually get that with just parts, right? Because they have to come together and then get the pre-approval for it to be effective and go through the expedited process. So we'd have to talk that through, I think, with Public Works.
And I have another question related to the pre-approval. Would that be with kind of specific manufacturers or shops who can build those? I'm just thinking it from
Right.
the side of
Right.
the business. Is the approved shop drawings going to be in a way that they can go to any vendor to purchase, install versus specific vendors that the shop drawings are tied to?
I think that we're still going to have to figure that out if there's a way to incorporate kind of pre-manufactured parts that could be incorporated. If not, then the intent would be that a restaurateur could take the shop drawings to a manufacturer and have them have all the details required to have them made.
That's all. All right, yeah, just to piggyback, sorry, Peter.
Board
Go
Member
ahead.
Hirsch, would you like to ask a question? Give David a chance to everybody.
You know, I think they were pretty well covered there so far, but just looking at certain practicalities here, I noticed that the Beverly Hills one seems to overlap the sidewalk in some way. And I'm thinking that we have a variety of sidewalks. So it might not work in some areas where the sidewalk is very shallow. I wonder if it isn't possible to do a kind of a schematic design. There aren't that many areas that this is going to be used. So you could establish all of the kind of basic stuff that's needed to be known beforehand here and do a preliminary schematic design to see exactly what problems you may run into relative to the differences between one area and another. And what utilities are where, you know, and that you can't cover, and et cetera. It would seem that would be a very useful document for you to have prior to doing the models. And you could foresee then some of the problems you're likely to run into.
Questions, David, questions right now.
Yeah. And then some aspects of this, you know, you seem to have given us a lot of material up front and then referred to the Beverly Hills sort of at the end of it all, rather than telling us right away that you were going to do the Beverly Hills. Could you explain what happened there that led to that? in terms of what you thought in terms of the design aspect of it, why you decided that? And also, have you actually seen it? Has it been produced and you've been there and seen it?
Thank you for the question. So this was per council direction to look at the Beverly Hills example. So that's what we started with. I have not personally visited to see, but it has been adopted. We actually saw a draft version and very recently saw one that's adopted along with kind of approval process and stuff. So we're using that as a template. I think again, it needs to be in the context of Palo Alto, and that's, where you're all kind of giving us feedback on the aesthetics, materials. So again, using that as a concept in terms of how the prototypes go through the approval process, how there's a user guide, but not necessarily using the same materials or design that is used in Beverly Hills.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the kit of parts and the concepts that we would work on creating for Palo Alto would still abide by the standards that we've spent years working on. So for example, the flooring example that you mentioned with how Beverly Hills, their flooring overlaps the sidewalk, that wouldn't, I don't foresee that being part of the Palo Alto one. The Palo Alto concepts would incorporate the drainage piece that we've worked with Public Works in the city to establish those standards.
The question that's been, a couple of questions that have been raised, the one about the neighbor possibly interested in either having a parklet or whatever other issues that might address a neighbor. For example, if there is a parklet that overlaps a neighbor and it does change ownership in between, and then it's a regular commercial space, what happens then if they say, this is interrupting my commercial space?
Sorry, just to understand the question, are you asking if a business that has a parklet changes over, or if there's a business that has a parklet and it overlaps another business and that business?
Yeah.
The standards, and it's not competing for the space itself. It just doesn't like the parklet. So the standards per council direction, if there is a roof or sidewalls on a parklet that encroaches over a neighboring business, they do require a letter of consent. But if I think the intent was because sidewalls or roof could obstruct the view of a business frontage. But if there is no sidewalls or roof, then consent is not required to encroach over a neighbor. So if a neighboring business didn't like the parklet, but there wasn't a need for a letter of consent, then there isn't existing a mechanism to dispute that parklet.
There is a mess.
Is not.
There isn't.
No.
Maybe there should be one. Consider that, because you could see some problems developing between. There's a lot of empty storefronts these days, around, and there'll be new owners or new leaseholders. And if it is also the leaseholders signs for the approval, or is it an owner that signs for the approval?
If a letter of consent is required, it's only required from the tenant, not the property owner.
Doesn't that seem questionable that the property owner ought to be on the approval process?
It was discussed in some length with council about whether a property owner or business owner or both should be required to provide consent. And it was council direction to only require consent from a tenant and not the property owner.
Okay. They're the word for that. Okay. I mean, I think that I sort of feel that some of the details, but I don't think it's time. This is not the place for talking about the details of what has been shown so far.
We'll come back to that,
until-
David, as we discuss we will come back to that. But
Mhm.
right now, I'm just trying to get some questions out if there's anything. Board Member Rosenberg, go ahead.
Thank you. One quick question would be in terms of some of these, you know, you can think about the roof canopy structures, right? There's the possibility for using a prefabricated version, right? There's some trellises out there, for example, that come with 4 posts. They've got louvers that are adjustable. Excuse me. They have lights, they have heaters, right? They have everything sort of prepped and ready to go. Is there going to be a process in place for if something is not specifically on an approved list that it can become one of the items that Palo Alto says, we know this product, this specific, you know, brand of something that can be a pre-approved structure because it's got whatever necessary safety certifications. Is there going to be a process that someone can bring a product to you and say, we'd like to have this approved, and then it gets approved for everyone? Does that, are you following what I'm saying? Like, it's,
Yes,
yeah, so instead
no,
of people having
I
to build
do.
everything from scratch.
Again, I think that's something that we would need to discuss with Public Works staff because they're the ones that approve anything in the public right of way. So we can kind of, the idea is to, you know, as much as we can streamline the approval process, right? So we'll look at what's possible. You could have, you know, variances, you could have different unique designs. It just adds to the time. So we can look at that
Sure.
to see if they can bring forward certain things. Again, as Hannah mentioned, you know, we're still in the early stages. So looking at what would make sense in terms of whether we can call out certain products and say auto approved equal,
Right.
and then, you know, just
Perfect,
go through
okay.
that process.
Excellent.
So-
Thank you.
Board Member Chen?
So I noticed for the pilot parklet program, it permitted for business, not only for restaurants, but also personal services and retails. Is it the same case for the permanent ones?
I'm just going to confirm exactly which uses. I believe I did, it is in the staff report. Yes, on, oh, I don't have the page, but it's right before the project description. It says eating and drinking establishments, commercial uses, and retail establishments.
Okay, so my follow-up question would be the prototype for restaurant might be not be feasible for the other types of business, right? So why we only limited to 3 types of prototypes?
You want me to take it? So again, if it doesn't work for the retail establishment, then they could always go with their own design. But this is not mandated. It's just something to help them.
Okay.
So if it doesn't work, they can use a different design.
So for the 3 prototypes, it's more focused for the restaurants only, right?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Board Member Adcock?
Can I ask questions on the permanent parklet program on the details here? So over on sorry, this is kind of on page 27, parklet setbacks. On the angled parking, I'm a little confused about the shape that's allowed on the permanent parklet on the angled parking. So it's from the stripe, it's 3 feet from either side, and it's kind of this trapezoidal shape. On the note there, it says setback between 2 adjacent angle spaces parklet shall be 8 feet, 2 4-foot setbacks, but the diagram shows 3 feet. Is that?
Which page is this?
Page 27, bottom of page 27.
Packet, page 27.
Thank you.
Yes, it's not 6 feet. It's not double the 3 feet, like it is double the 4 feet for parallel. The 8 feet setback requirement between parklets was a result of discussions with fire. So if there's an angled parklet that is not directly adjacent to another one, then it would be 3 feet. But if there is another parklet adjacent, then it would have to be a 4-foot setback for each parklet to create.
So
The
if, a-
8.
if one parklet goes in first and puts a 3-foot setback because there wasn't one there, then the next person putting the parklet next to it would have to be 5 feet back to meet this 8 feet. Is that correct?
I'm not sure that that scenario has been fully worked out or worked through yet. So it's something that we would work with Public Works and Fire to determine how to handle that situation.
Thank you. I have one more on page 32. Actually, I have 2 more, just to clarify. On page 32 about headroom and location, it says roof shall be a minimum of 8 feet provided the adjacent sidewalk is at least 8 feet wide. It's talking about the height, but in terms of, this for guidelines for who might go in for, their own permit, is there a headroom requirement versus height requirement? Is 8 feet, and by building code, it would be 7.6 minimum. That gives them 6 inches to build a roof. Right? Is that what it's trying to imply?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but there is not, to my knowledge, a headroom standard for the parklets. There's a minimum and maximum height standard.
Then perhaps we should add that in, because by building code, you cannot have public spaces less than 7.6. So that would imply that, they're limited to the sandwich of roof that they can make. So my last question is regarding the roof material. On here, it's item 3 I's, kind of 3 on page 33, that defines roof material, but it's also defined on I guess the roof material is defined exactly the same in 2 places. And I'm curious what the intent is. So roof material shall be solid uniform material or open construction, trellis, pergola, etc. on the material section. And on the structure section, again, item 3 in the structure, roof may be solid uniform material, open construction, trellis, pergola, etc. So just clarification on which one, it seems to define material, not structure, in that statement. So just asking for clarity on that when you revise it.
So I think C3 there is duplicative. The materials under the material section C are called out to be plywood sheathing, polycarbonate sheets, or sheet metal. So I think it's duplicative.
All right, thank you.
The whole statement is duplicative. I mean, I can't imagine a roof that's not either open or a solid material.
Right.
So we can get to that, I think, as we
Yeah.
discuss this in more detail.
I have another question.
Go ahead, David.
The propane heaters, are they going to be allowed somehow? How is that going to work relative to the materials that are selected?
They can be allowed, but they come with quite a few constraints. So
Yeah.
depends on if the restaurant's able to meet those requirements. They need a hazmat permit to have propane heaters, and there's some requirements related to the storage. Also proximity to flammable materials. So if they have a roof that's really not going to be allowed, and they'd have to go with electric heaters. So it depends, and which is why we kind of showed on the slide, that's something that may determine whether people choose to go with roofs or without. Because if they want to have propane heaters, then if they have any kind of roof, that's not going to be allowed.
Okay,
So
I see.
Can I follow up on that, please? The requirements for propane heaters are basically a hazmat permit, which seems fairly comprehensive. Is that required for a restaurant having an outdoor patio on private property? Are they required to have the same standard of hazmat permitting?
I would assume so, but we can confirm. I mean, it's a safety requirement. I would assume the requirements would be the same in terms of just proximity to flammable materials and how they're stored. So it's not a safety hazard.
Yeah, I don't know the answer on the hazmat, but certainly all the roofing requirements and everything is the same as what's allowed for private.
I ask because many of us have seen restaurants with portable propane heaters under roofs, gas tanks stored just inside the restaurant at night. And if we're going to, well, we'll get to the comments on it later. I had a question about the power supply requirements. If a parklet wants to have electric power, what options do they have to get the power to the parklet? I wasn't clear on your description here how that happened.
It is outlined a little bit further on within the standards. At a high level, their options would, if they would like permanent lighting fixtures or permanent electrical fixtures on the parklet, they would need to require an electrical permit from the city. Alternatively, a GFCI outlet can be installed on the building, the primary building itself, and then a guide wire can lead a single cord to the parklet to put up string lights or that type of.
Okay, so I'm
Lighting.
asking because in the standards I recall working on, we were quite specific on how that power went across the sidewalk. A number of conduits that had to be painted a certain color. Is that in here someplace?
I need to double check. I think that some of the design elements were in, as we worked through with staff on the kind of requirements and safety, and some of those may have been required to be more flexible or moved. But I'm just trying to see if I can find the section in the standards. Yes, under D, furnishings and fixtures, item 2, electrical power supply.
Page,
Packet page 39. Okay, so there's nothing in here now about how that wire gets across the street or across the sidewalk. And then my other question
It's-
to you is,
Item B, power cords between the building and the parklet shall be secured to one overhead guide wire between the building and the parklet structure.
okay, yeah, that's exactly where I'm going to want to talk about that. And why is it that we wouldn't want people to put a power cord underground in a conduit below the sidewalk?
From what I recall, I believe in conversations with the city, there wasn't a desire to tear up the concrete or the
Curb,
sidewalk.
et
Yeah,
cetera.
yeah, for the conduit. But we can get back to you on exactly what the reasoning was there.
Could I, could I,
Go ahead, David, yes.
can you tell us, have you projected how the prototype will be developed as a design and when we will, whether or not we will have input along the way?
Yes, certainly. So again, we will be coming back to ARB as a whole, put our timeline in early May. But again, if you choose to establish an ad hoc committee, then we can work with that committee on specific design elements between now and then.
So it would be up to the committee if they bring it back through the chairman and say if the whole board wants to see what it is at some point, then it would be brought back to the board as well.
No, we plan to bring it back to the board in
board.
May.
Oh, okay.
The
fine.
ad
May.
hoc, if you
Will
choose to
be
assign one, would be
Interim if
additional.
necessary. Yeah. Mhm.
Right.
Okay, that's fine.
One
That's true.
last question I want to get to. Former Mayor Karen Holman brought up in the public comment about Ramona Street being a special district. Has any thought been given to at special locations requiring some sort of design or historic resource review?
Yes, thank you. So we are aware that Ramona has a very different character from University Avenue, and that's something that we haven't really started looking at what would be specific in terms of elements. The three prototypes that we've been talking about don't really look at the historic element. They're more to be used elsewhere. But there is kind of a separate work effort, I think, related to Ramona, just given the car-free nature of it and then the historic nature. So even though it's part of the greater downtown, we recognize that we will need a different approach for that. So we will bring that forward for discussion to this body as well.
And it's under that logic that you've excluded California Avenue from the Parklet program, is that right? Because it's a car-free street.
Free street. And I think there's been quite a bit of engagement already on that piece. So that's moving on its own timeline, just the car-free street portion of California Avenue. So that's a whole separate effort. Ramona was also part of it until pretty recently, but recognizing that really it's part of downtown, it's a very different look with its historic designation. That's been separated from the Cal Ave effort.
Thank you.
May I ask a question about the accessibility? So on packet page 33, number 5 in F, it says at least 5% of the sitting space and 5% of the standing space shall be accessible. So is it 5% of the square footage or the seat count, the number of seats? And considering the size of the parklet, 5% is quite low, so we always round it up, or so say there are only two standing seats provided, so at least one of them should be accessible. Is it correct?
Yes, it does round up and for parklets, and I believe it's the seating spaces, not the square footage.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've asked quite a few questions, have we? Shall we start diving in with comments and suggestions, ideas? I think it's all mixing together, but who wants to get us started? Board Member Hirsch?
You know, actually, I'd like to continue with one question here. I'm noting the fire access issue seems rather serious issue, and what's indicated in the drawing are sort of similar divisions of it, so equal divisions of each of the parklets in order to create a fire access.
Are you referring to the
On page
image?
36. Is that a standard then? Is there going to be a sort of a standard of fire access along the street that is required, and that will make any alteration in the modular development of the?
So the image on page 36 of the packet is an example of what may be required by fire. It's not a requirement unless fire deem it necessary, and the purpose or the intent of that standard or the ability for fire to require that is in case there's a very, very long parklet. It's anticipated that most parklets will be small enough that the 8-foot gap between parklets would be sufficient to provide fire access. But should a business owner propose a very, very long parklet, fire would like the ability to require access.
So that changes kind of the modularity of it in some way, doesn't it?
It's something that will need to be considered.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Do you want to start?
Okay.
Why don't you continue, David, with some
well,
comments on all this?
I mean, actually, one of the things that wasn't as well kind of laid out was just, although a variety of planters were shown in the Beverly Hills on the, there wasn't any real detail in the specs so far on the planters. That is still a question, right? What you'll be doing with that? You'll have a modular planter of some sort, right? To be selected or what?
Yes, the Beverly Hills example is not the best example from the planter's perspective. The Palo Alto program actually does not allow planters.
Oh.
So planters will not be part of, at least currently, not be part of the design. It will be a enclosure of some sort of guardrail type structure, but not planters themselves. And I'm happy to try my best to answer any questions or follow-up questions about that.
The details. We're going to be tough.
To my colleagues, I have another idea, actually. Why don't we work through this in a series of parts of comments on different components of this to be more efficient, perhaps. So I'm looking at one whole discussion would be about the kit of parts versus a comprehensive design and how that's worked out. So what do we think about that? I think another round of discussion would be on, I think you can break it into the floor, the platform construction, the walls, the enclosures, and then the roof. What feedback can we give them on that subject? And then there's the various technical aspects of heaters, electric power, things like that. Can we just work under those directions first?
Yeah.
And
Then there's furnishings.
Right. So
Furnishings.
I would make one comment that I think we need to zoom out one lens bigger than that initially. And what I mean by that is that in the Beverly Hills example, they actually do a very good job of explaining that sort of part one in theirs, and maybe it's, called A or something in ours. It shows, site, envelope, drainage, utilities, neighbor consent, fire, that sort of stuff. So all of those pre-planning items, that's sort of one chunk of this. The second part would be this kit of parts, right? That then we can get into the details of which items in this kit of parts do we want to include, not include, things like that. And then again, in the Beverly Hills example, they have the third part, I'm going to call it C, where it's sort of the application process. And I think that maybe we talk about that's application and construction, like what's the, when they get to building it, who do they need to contact and when? So that's sort of the one level out that I might say if we're all sort of comfortable. I guess I'm just going to dive into my comment. I think that Beverly Hills is a good example of that, sort of having those three distinct parts. One is sort of site and prep work, two is the actual parklet itself, and then three is the application and construction elements of it. And I think that having that sort of as a basis, we can cover a lot of those utility items, the electrical panel upgrades, the drainage sort of requirements in that early set, and then focus the second portion, that B, that kit of parts, on the actual structure itself. How do my colleagues feel about that?
That's fine, Kendra, except I really don't want to sidetrack too much in things that are not really on our purview. The fire department's got to decide how it is. The issues of parking clearance and stuff we can chime in on that, but a lot of that needs to be decided.
Understood.
by people.
And I guess for the part one, it would be a very sort of low key efforts. Going back to one item that board member Adcock had mentioned is that, if we're going to allow 3 feet, but then change it to 4 feet later because the next door neighbor comes in, I think that that's not quite fair to whoever's there. So either set the standard at 3 feet or set it at 4 feet, but having them change it is problematic. So I think that again, and it's not something we need to decide today. It's just, I think that concept should be included in part one with the site
Okay.
layout, and then,
Let's start our discussion with site planning, I'll call it.
okay.
Yeah.
Which has to do
I
with the
agree.
layout standards, things like that. And
Perfect.
board member Adcock, you brought up the questions. You start. What's your opinion of the proposed site planning guidelines?
On the site planning, kind of stepping back even further in terms of like what parking spaces are they even allowed to use, right? In terms of in front of their own business to encroaching into the next business. It does seem quite problematic regarding the consent part. And particularly like, is it if the leaseholder leaves, whether it's at the end of their lease or they go out of business, like it seems problematic for the next neighbor, even if it's a 1-year timeline. A lot can happen in a restaurant business in a 1-year timeline. And then related to that, the 3 feet versus 5 feet, like kind of starting with where are they allowed to be? Where do they need consent versus not? And that's a little bit out of our purview, but it affects the site planning effort. And then beyond that, kind of back to what board member Hirsch had brought up about the 3 feet space between the parklets, it does say 20 feet max, right? Which makes it such that the 350 square foot allowed is not even valid, right?
Are you referring again to page 36 with
Yeah.
the access? So like I mentioned, it's not a requirement. It's, it may be required if the fire department deems it necessary for access. But in a 350 square foot parklet would likely not need to comply with that access.
So it's the two requirements are counter to each other. And if this becomes a requirement, then the 350 square feet cannot be upper limit, right? Because 20 feet times about 8 feet of the
Oh, I see
parklet.
your question.
They-
Yes, it's
They're allowed up to 350 square foot ones.
and
Correct, but each
that-
one cannot be contiguously 350 square feet if we're making them break it up every 3 feet, or is it just the roof?
So the 350 square foot size limit is restricted to parklets with roofs. So if you do not have a roof, then you don't have a size limit. And the reason for that 350 threshold is because above and beyond that, sprinklers are required and a whole host of other requirements. Yeah, so if you have a roof, you're limited to 350. You could have 2 parklets, so you could separate them by 8 feet and have a second parklet. Or if you have no roof, you're not restricted by size.
And this diagram on page 36, that 3 foot gap, that's just for having a gap on the roof, not a gap on the parklet, is that correct?
No,
But it's all,
it would be a gap all the way through from platform to roof.
so if it's a 20-foot max and your parklet based on one parking space is just 8 feet, right? So 8 times 20 is, and then you have, so 8 times 20 is 160, right? So your parklet cannot be 360. Am I missing something?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question.
This, on the top of this diagram on page 36, it says 20-foot max between the 3-foot gaps.
Yes, the diagram is implying that a 3-foot gap may be required every 20 feet in a parklet with a roof or not with a roof. But again, it's a may be required
Mhm.
if the fire department feels that access is not sufficient without this gap.
Let me chime in here, being more blunt. I think the 20-foot requirement is far too restrictive. Many restaurants have greater than 20 feet of frontage, and requiring them to break up the parklet in the middle
Yeah.
is not reasonable, and I believe not necessary. I think we should push back to the fire department. Their goal is 100% life safety above all else. They would not have parklets at all if they could do that.
Mm.
When you have cars parked, you don't get the 3-foot space guaranteed. This seems to be an excessive standard. And I think we as a board
Yeah.
should push back, and you as a staff should also be pushing back that this is one thing that we have to be more flexible on for these things to be successful.
We can bring that back in.
That's the kind of
Agreed.
feedback
Yeah.
I'm looking for us to push back
Yeah.
on is, do
If
we
we're
think
going to
that-
give them the 350 square foot limit, they should be allowed to build 350 if they have the frontage, the consent, without having to break up the little parklet into 20-foot chunks,
I would think more like 40 foot or something.
right?
I don't see why we need a square foot limitation whatsoever. They basically have their frontage times the width of whatever parking is in front of their business. And, a restaurant that happens to have a lot of frontage, well, why not let them have the bigger parklet too? They're paying the rent on the space anyway. So in my opinion, again, that square footage is just going to lead into difficulties in how you calculate it, making the approval process more complicated. And it's not really necessary because they can't make these that big.
Yeah, we can bring the access back and ask fire if there is flexibility or more rationale on why
So-
maybe it's 20 feet or not.
Chair, if I may,
Yes.
I'm just wondering if we have parklets, different businesses all had a parklet, and so they were one after the other. I would assume that's where fire is going to have some real concerns, is that if it's, all of these, it's really 100 feet long when you
Yeah,
add them
no, you're
all
right
up.
about
But you're requiring the 8-foot gap between them anyway,
Okay,
right? So that is the gap that.
okay,
you're being
so we'll take that back to fire and see.
Your concern is really about a parklet having to be divided up. So we'll take that input. and we'll
In
follow
the
up.
same vein, I'll make a comment that when you have the angled parking, it seems you're asking the parklet to be 3 feet away from the edge of the parking stripe. And again, I think that's overly restrictive. If a car were there, the space would be more like 1 foot. And if we accept that, to get out of my car in an angled spot, I've got to clear the 2 feet of space, basically, 1 foot on my side and 1 on the neighbor's. Why wouldn't a parklet be the same thing? 3 feet again is just much more restrictive. So that's my opinion looking at this. Any other comments on site planning? This kind of question. Okay, shall we? I'd like to pick up the kit of parts idea at the end of this discussion. That's, I think, a bigger thing. Any comments regarding the platform, the floor, construction detail, things like that? It seems to me that you should allow pressure treated wood as well as steel framing on that. Many restaurateurs are going to be using what I call a B-level contractor, someone less expensive, who's much more comfortable with pressure treated wood. Pressure treated wood is just about as durable, but much more commonly used. You can buy it at the Home Depot. And to restrict that makes it more challenging for restaurateurs to build these platforms.
Actually, on that note, I can't find it now, but it says pressure treated in parentheses, fire retardant treated, or the other way around somewhere in here. And we should say one or the other, although in my own experience, we've been able to prove that fire retardant and treated also works as pressure treated, but it was a whole lot of research to prove that on a particular project. So typically you either buy pressure treated wood or fire retardant treated wood, and it doesn't come with double certification. So we should be clear, if we're really asking for that, then it is, asking the business to use a very specific product versus the in parentheses, as you've noted.
Why would you want fire treated wood on the platform of your parklet?
That's
It's a question
a
for
good
staff,
question,
but
yeah.
fire treated wood is difficult, expensive, not readily available. And it's made for a very specific thing when you're building in a fire zone, or you have a building that has a special restrictions that fire is really a hospital, for example. That's not what we're talking about here. If we keep it simple and materials that are readily available, it's much easier for restaurateurs to build these things.
And if it's a material specific for, say, roof, then it could be pressure treated for the platform versus for the overhead structure roof. For fire reasons, fire department may push for fire retardant treated, which is also fine, but it can't be both too easily. Yeah.
I'm going to come to a general comment overall, but I think as much as possible, we should just stick to the building code and ADA, et cetera, codes that exist. So for example, the platform really should just meet building code requirements. And if it's, or the canopy as well, when we get to that, if it's required to be fire treated, it needs to be, but if it's not otherwise required, we shouldn't go beyond that. How about the material for the platform, the surface, the finish? What's in here now and what do we feel about that?
Are we on page 32 on the material?
Help me out here. What page is that on? Platform. Well, the platform has structure, drainage, attachment. Is there any description of what the surface material of the platform needs to be? I recall in the past, we just said it could be almost any kind of lumber type material, artificial wood or natural wood, cedar or pressure treated lumber.
Yes, I think that there may not be specific materials for the platform itself listed in the standards. There are materials listed in a separate materials section that would apply to the platform. And I'm just going to find that page for you.
I mean, I see on packet page 51 at the very bottom, there's the section that says materials, platform parklets should be constructed with quality materials, but that's the platform itself, roof, enclosure, sidewalls, furnishing and fixtures, but it doesn't specifically call out anything for flooring.
Okay, well, should it? How much do we want to try to regulate that?
I mean, I think, yes, I think there's some that are very clear sort of violations. Let me put it that way. It's, you don't want sort of open steel treads. That's not a good idea, right? It's going to be problematic for accessibility and high heels. And you don't really want like exposed plywood because that won't hold up well, right? So I think that there's a huge variety of floorings that we can pre-approve, but maybe it's easier to say the things that aren't allowed.
What I mean, apologize for not knowing this
No,
up
please.
front, but what does the building code require for outdoor deck surface materials?
No more than 1/4 inch gap, I believe. So grates would not be allowed anyway, just
Right.
based on building.
And how about
Sorry, did you-
durability? Isn't it required to be weather resistant or durable somehow?
Not necessarily. It's more, I could be wrong, but it's more in terms of like, because even, finished surfaces are allowed to be flammable. It's just the structure is not allowed to be. So I would think in this particular case, again, back to meeting building code and in terms of gaps and all of that, and in like finish, like say, they could use plywood with traffic coating on it, which is allowed for any building on a roof or deck or any of that, right? So why wouldn't it be allowed here?
I agree.
Yeah.
It seems to me if the code allows it,
Mhm.
that should be fine for
Yeah.
parklet as well. Makes the regulation very easy to refer back to the building code.
I think in terms of kit parts, the structure of the platform is the frame structure as proposed here is one part of it, whether we allow wood, pressure treated wood, or just steel. Is it has the load capacity and all of that tied to it. But as far as finished material itself, I feel like the kit parts, it doesn't even have to specify any particular finished material.
I would think it just says some code compliant material.
Right. Mhm.
To that extent, I'm looking at page 30. You specify in here the load capacity of 100 pounds per square foot. The same comment applies. Let the building code govern that number.
Mhm. Yeah.
It may well be the appropriate amount, but why make it complicated? Just go back to the code. On the drainage, do we want to get into that more? I think that's at the curb. You want to be sure water can flow along the street all the way up and down the street.
Yes, and for it to be accessible. So there's a kind of a grate over top. So owner could remove the grate, clear that of debris so water can flow freely.
That seems to make sense to me.
Yeah, kind of related to that, I think in terms of drainage on the outer edges of the platform, it seems to imply that there's some kind of screening to, protect. Is that also to allow for water to go towards the drain? Is there a minimum opening that I can't really tell if that's being specified?
Yes, there's a minimum opening. That gap needs to be, I think it's a minimum of 6.5 inches.
Right, on the drain on the horizontal surface. But because this parklet structure is going to sit on the parking space, for water to not get blocked by the parklet itself, is there provision
Oh,
for
I
that?
see. So at the
The side
kind of
walls or
parallel
side
to
curb,
the,
yeah.
right. I don't believe there is an existing kind of drainage component to the platform edge that's running parallel to the travel lane at the moment.
It kind of relates to that. If there's a storm drain inlet that happens to be right in front of this business, are they allowed to put their parklet on top of it? As long as, again, from the sides, rainwater from the street can get to that inlet.
There's currently a 5-foot setback requirement from a storm drain catch basin. So no, they would not currently be able to put a parklet in front of one.
Yeah, I recall thinking then, and I still think now that that's too restrictive again. If water can get to the drain grate and there's a lid they can lift up to service it, why not let them use that space as well? 5 feet is a pretty restrictive requirement. If you have, say, a 50-foot frontage and it's 2/3 of the way in, you're basically making it not possible.
Okay, we'll take note of that.
Would that mean you'd have to frame around it separately? And so the modular idea of construction will be affected.
Possibly, although I imagine a kit of parts would just sort of stipulate that, you have to ensure drainage to whatever's under there. You're not going to get into laying out the structure, the framing plan. You just sort of stipulate. These are very simple things. There's 2x6 platforms on the street.
Yeah.
Let's go into the enclosures, the sidewalls that make these up. I'll start with a generic comment that some of these regulations regarding dimensions and loads seem to me taken out of the UBC stair or guardrail requirements. And again, we discussed this last time. Those are inappropriate. Those are the guidelines designed to prevent people from falling when you have a difference in grade elevation. It all triggers at 30-inch elevation difference. That's just not the case here. If you were trying to prevent a vehicle from crashing into the parklet, you'd need a much more stringent requirement. But otherwise, a 200-pound lateral load requirement for these enclosures is too much. It's actually tricky to build that without getting some real serious anchorage to the street or the platform. And that's probably not necessary. Same thing applies to the 42-inch minimum height. I think that's too high. I think we'd set closer to 30 or 32 inches or something. We discussed this at length, and I'd like it very much if we could go back to that discussion, or at least have you guys looking at that as we're doing this. That's my initial sense on these enclosures.
Also on that note, there's the 4-inch sphere notification,
Same
which
thing
again,
again,
same
yeah.
thing. It's
That's
not necessary.
Crazy.
Yeah, you're trying to prevent a child that's the 99th percentile of American babies' heads don't fit through that from crawling through because they would fall and hurt themselves. They can't fall when there's no grade difference. Apply the regular building code. If there is a grade change, the whole code should apply. If there's not, let's not make things up that aren't intended for that.
I guess counter to that is, or whether it's counter or in support of, like, it's basically like sidewalk, a kid walking along the sidewalk versus with the traffic next to it, if there's no parking, is very similar to being sitting in the parklet. Right. So as far as the 42-inch guardrail, I agree with you that it's not necessary because you're not dropping 30 inches. But in terms of the 4-inch spacing, if you're seated here and you're having dinner with your kids next to, and there's traffic right pretty much like 3 feet away, and the Beverly Hills requirements with the planter is basically providing that. It kind of seems like maybe it seems maybe too much, but it's extra level of precaution of safety. That 4-inch spacing is not hard to achieve, and we can let go of the 200-pound and the 42-inch height, but the 4-inch spacing seems like it adds protection for especially younger children who might be seated next to that edge.
Okay, those are points well made.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I have a kind of a sense of this as a guardrail kind of a division between the inside and the outside. Isn't going to be a great looking item anyhow, right? I mean,
no, we want it to be good looking, David.
well, I see that the idea of the planters seems to me to be a much nicer way to create a division between the parklet and the street.
Yeah, I thought planters.
And the traffic of the street.
Did I hear you say planters are not allowed?
Yes, planters are not allowed. It is one of the changes that occurred in September, and after lengthy discussion with council specific, and this ties into the guardrail requirements, and they're all linked to traffic safety concerns. And
that was a strong desire of the ARB when we looked at it last time. The planters were what gave it a softness that was kind of important.
yes,
Exactly. Thank you.
So pretty stubborn up here. My opinion hasn't changed, and we're going to push hard for that. You need to incorporate planters to make this suitable. Let me give you a comment again. I've made all this before, but the sidewall enclosure to me it's an important safety barrier. It's an important enclosure for the restaurant. It's also important for the community as a whole to be able to see through and past these things. And it's important for the people who are sitting on these parklets to be able to see out. Maintaining that visual connection to the rest of the public realm is paramount. To do that, at 42 inches is the height of a person's eye level when they're seated. In other words, you're blocking their ability to see out or people to see who they are. And that immediately says what we're doing with these spaces is creating private dining areas. And I think at a high level, we should be thinking of this differently. These are outdoor spaces that we're allowing restaurants to use, but it's still in the public realm. That means that they should be able to see out and people should be able to see in and through. That's the rationale for having the glazed partitions above these enclosures to be perfectly transparent so that you can see through them. We should keep that in mind as we go through all of this.
The Beverly Hills one says 38 inches. So if we even, use that guide, but they do have the 200 pounds, 4-inch, the 200 pounds when applied at 36 inch and then the 4-inch max opening.
So how many of us have been through a plan check process on a project and gotten the comment back, demonstrate with engineering calculations that you meet the 200-pound requirement? And imagine the poor guy running the burrito shop being told to do that.
Mhm.
It's hard. It's not an easy calculation to prove.
Especially when you cannot attach to the ground. I think that's the key. Like in many of our projects for handrails, guardrails, we do provide calcs for that if asked, but it's attached to some serious structure to go with it.
Yeah, we do too. And it's a real calculation.
Right,
It's an engineering effort.
Yeah.
So, it makes sense when you're protecting people from falling off a round thing. And
Right.
you want that, but
Yeah.
that's the different situation here.
And that's part of the benefit of the prototype kind of program. The reasoning for doing it is that these calculations would be done in part of the shop drawings and part of the kind of pre-approved permit, so that business owners don't have to go and find an engineer and engineer a railing that can meet the 200-pound. This process would do that for them, and all the kit of parts would be built in order to comply with these standards, and then they could just pick up the permits and build it.
Understood to some extent. I think the hard part is that having these prototypes, is that assuming that there's a continuous system from platform through railing up to roof that's like done and set and pre-approved? But then do they have variation on the type of railing it's going to be, or do they have to use the specific type, right? So that's, I guess, where the questions are, is how do we get away from, and again, I might be speaking out of turn with my colleagues here, but how do we get away from this modular, this set thing that's already done and make the kit of parts work in a similar method, right? You can have railing type A, B, or C. These are all pre-approved. They all have their calcs ready to go. And maybe it's not a 200-pound overturning, but I do think there does need to be some overturning. You don't want someone leaning against that railing and falling into traffic.
Mhm.
So that's a really, like we're talking about with the kids getting through the 4-inch gap. On a similar note, if you've got a 200-pound man leaning against this railing because he's, out enjoying dinner with his family, and that thing falls over into traffic, that would be a tragedy, right? And we don't want that. So not necessarily circling back to the 200 pounds of overturning pressure, but saying, okay, what are the connections for this type of railing? What are the connections for this? And instead of providing, you can only choose railing A or B, saying, okay, you can choose the attachment method of A or B, right? And sort of that's where the structural calculations come into play, because it doesn't have to be horizontal railing to comply. It's really about the connection itself of that railing to the platform. So I think that's where the kit of parts is sort of struggling a little bit, because we don't necessarily want to dictate how this looks. We want to dictate how it functions. Does that make sense? Right? We want this railing to hold up and provide safety, but do we care if it's, welded wire mesh, or do we care if it's vertical posts or horizontal posts? No. Right? As long as it's compliant and safe, that's what matters. And I think that this kit of parts really needs to keep focused in that direction. If I'm making my point clear enough.
It is, but we're going to get into the kit of parts in a little bit. I'm looking at page 36, talking about the design of these enclosures. And comment C says parklets shall integrate or incorporate vegetation into the enclosure treatment. Then section I talks about the plant material. Yeah, I thought so they have to do the vegetation and plant material without a planter.
Yeah, it's something that staff has noted and is working through.
I'm going to say it again. We went through this for at least a full hearing, maybe two, regarding the planters and how important they were and how they would get built and what dimension and weight they should have and the spacing between them. And I thought we came up with some pretty good suggestions. So I'm rather astonished to find you just arbitrarily, seemingly, just get rid of all of that. And then it's still in here anyway.
Well, I
Those
think
are
that-
important things.
Hasn't a lot to do with that.
Is it the council? Is this coming from city council?
Yes, they're related to traffic safety and direction from council.
So I think we should be given a chance to speak to the council as well to make sure they understand the full implication of this.
I mean, yeah, it's an aesthetic issue. It's a kind of a pleasantness about the environment that we're looking, I think we're all looking for here, that really ought to occur, that if we answer just code issues, we're not there yet. And so actually, as you move to a prototype, you better, because we're going to come back with that one, I think, that then we're looking for some extra niceties to these structures. And planting, which you mentioned here, we would support it. We would have supported that in the beginning, and it's unfortunate that it's been cut out.
We required it, not just supported it. And we felt it was one of the things that gave you greater traffic safety. I mean,
Yes,
a
absolutely.
500-pound box of dirt is much better than a 200-pound lateral loaded railing.
Mhm.
That-
And
that-
psychologically as well, for people who are sitting inside, the railing, unless it's, well, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, the 12-inch separation gives you a little bit more comfort when you're there. In so many ways, it was a good thing.
And another element that we discussed before is about the shading, right? So we were talking about like whether we are allowed to have the retractable or removable shadings, or
You're talking the roof structure? Or the
Even
vertical
vertically,
shading?
vertical. Yeah, and then speaking of the intent is for be seen or seen from the street, then I think we make the conclusion,
That was close. That one, we were really torn.
is it?
So the issue was between the safety enclosure and the roof, if you have one. Restaurateurs strongly wanted a way to block wind with a glass piece and sunlight. Some of these have orientation where you get very strong afternoon sun. So can they have a drop-down shade? If you go to Nola's restaurant now, they have little chains and the people sitting in their booths can actually raise and lower that sunscreen. And in the afternoon, it gets pretty hot there otherwise.
So that should be
For
something
page
included in
37,
the
it's not allowed.
sidewall design.
And I believe that
It's
was in
clearly
the end.
noted that it's not allowed.
And I think in the end, we felt that you have to let that happen. And we said, as long as they're movable or adjustable shades, that was a reasonable accommodation.
And from my understanding, this is sort of broken into two parts. There's the enclosure, which is sort of the lower half, right? That's the safety element. And then the
Right.
sidewalls are specifically, it's kind of looking at that above the railing, what's going on there. And on packet page 37, it's got number 4, sidewalls. Parklets may include a hard transparent screen between the enclosure and the roof to provide a windscreen for parklet users. Again, what if they don't have a roof? Then that's a question. The side wall must have completely transparent and not obstruct sightlines from travel lane to sidewalk. Materials that are not permitted, vinyl, soft plastic, glass, or tarps. Sidewalls are not permitted in front of any neighboring storefronts without letter of consent, right? So that's sort of that segment there.
So
And then-
what completely transparent materials are not hard plastic or glass?
Acrylic is about it.
And, okay, those are
Acrylic is
details. We'll
also
get in,
kind of
we'll get,
plastic.
we'll get into the details with you through the ad hocs. It's not fair to jump into all that, but we had felt that retractable or adjustable awnings to prevent sunlight were also reasonable. So we'd like to have that noted. That does block traffic sight lines. And it goes against what I was talking about being in the public realm, but that's one of those balancings between the utility of a parklet versus public benefit from the outside.
You mentioned before the openness for visibility, but I could see restaurateurs preferring to have it as more of an enclosure because it feels more like a separate space.
Oh, they do. They do. If you go to the Bistro Vita over in Menlo Park, it's enclosed with these heavy fabrics and drapes and TVs on the wall. It's like you're being inside the guy's restaurant. It's
Mhm.
great. It's a wonderful
Yeah.
space. But this is public property. It's not the same thing. If they want to enclose a fabric TV viewing room, they can rent a building to do that. I think it's important to keep this in mind. This is not the same thing. In my opinion, that's where I come down on it.
Sort of, there's two ways to look at it. They might, by seeing people looking in, they see, oh, it's very busy today. So, it's obviously a great place to go. People are there. So, I mean, there's multiple ways to look at this, but some of the ones on California Street, I notice, are completely fabriced in.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem with the pedestrian experience on that street is that you're weaving between these closed-in vinyl booths.
Mhm.
That's hardly
It's true.
the experience we all are looking for. It's not what it's like in Santa Barbara.
Mhm.
And it's not what it's like on Ramona Street where we're more successful at this.
Yeah. Mhm. Okay.
Okay, any other comments on the sidewalls and the enclosure? So let's move to the roof if you have one. I think the question board member ad hoc brought up about the height of these is important because 7'6" is the minimum code height, so you could just let that be governed by the code. And from a zoning and planning point of view, we're concerned about the total overall height, I suppose. But why?
8 feet is quite restricted.
Yeah. Why not just stick to a maximum height and not worry about the minimum height? Say 10 or 12 feet.
I think it's a minimum. Wasn't it minimum? Yeah.
Minimum is 8 and maximum is 12. So yeah, I think headroom, I think like clarifying headroom or to just note that it's per building code.
Why do you need a minimum height limitation at all?
Yeah, we don't.
I mean, building code says 7'6", but I think just writing it very clearly because it's, prevents someone from having to go look it up, just say minimum clearance is 7'6" per code compliance, done, move on. And that's minimum clearance, and then you've got a maximum height, and we can work within that.
Yep.
And what maximum height do we think is appropriate?
Well, how is this going to work with the kit of parts?
Well, the kit of parts has to specify a height or a range of heights.
So you have columns that are 2 foot different?
Well, the engineer has to handle it for whatever the maximum height is. We say it should never be more than 12 feet. So you would engineer it at 12 feet. The same structure can support 8 feet or 9 or 10 feet. I think 12 feet is too tall. I think that's unnecessary for the size of these. It's out of scale. And again, it just blocks even further visibility. So I would say 10 feet is the maximum height.
Yeah, most storefronts are around 10 feet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do have one question. Is there any situation where this roof would be like a gable style? I mean, I keep thinking we're all sort of focused on these being sort of more shed roofs, right? They probably angle up as close as possible to the storefront and then they angle out towards the street. Is that really like sort of the only allowable version here, or a flat trellis? Because I wouldn't see any need for a gable. So I think that would prevent you
yeah.
needing it to go quite so tall. So that's where I'm getting at with this. If there's not a sloped roof, then we can bring this height limit down. And if it's just a low slope shed, then that
I
keeps it
would
pretty
think
low.
we could just specify these shall be flat roofed structures.
How about the electrical heating? Oh,
You do need a height clearance for that as well.
Yeah.
Let them, there's codes about that. Let them figure it out. If they want an electric heater, then they've got to meet UL listing and building code requirements. We don't need to specify that.
I think the upper limit in terms, if shed is allowed, which seems like could be,
Could be.
in the 8 feet depth, if it's say 10,
Maybe
then
it's two.
should be enough.
1 to 2. No, I'm sorry.
1.5
2 to
to
12,
2 to
1.5.
12, yeah.
which is doable with most roof types. It does, like metal roofs and such can be doable other than.
Maybe
open.
11-foot height limit just to give a little more flexibility.
I think so, just so the shed option with the 8 on the lower side is still within reason.
Claire, do you think that makes sense? What's a reasonable visual bulk of these things on the street front?
I mean, this is just kind of a personal opinion, I guess. So yeah, I don't know if I should be.
Oh, that's a
providing-
professional opinion. We're planners. We're constantly concerned about massing and zoning.
Yeah, I mean, 12 seems a little bit tall. I think that you could do a design in less than 12 feet and still, if we wanted to have a shed design or flat roof design. Do you guys want to have multiple designs? Do you think there's I don't know if business owners have expressed any interest in a shed design versus a flat roof design, or if that matters. You know,
Well, a lot of these vinyl tent structures are pitched roofs because that's the easiest way to build the frame of them. And I think that's what we want to avoid.
yes, right.
So by saying a flat or shed, a slightly sloped roof, you eliminate that out of the gate. I'd like to think somebody may want to create some very interesting roof form at some point. And that, I don't see any harm in letting people do that. But I think the design guidelines are best just giving it a simple height limit and say it's measured from the sidewalk height. And I could go with 10 or 11 feet.
11 gives them a little bit more flexibility, especially with the angled parking where you have a little bit more depth, then you can slope a little bit more, but still limited to 11.
It's true if you're going out 18 feet or so.
Right.
The sidewalk height or the street height?
Well, I was thinking from the platform height, but
Yeah.
I don't, whatever you think. Maybe the street is usually sloped though coming in. So again, you get to this
Yeah.
question mark of how you measure the height.
Yeah, I think platform height will be the only way to really kind of pre-manufacture these.
Right.
Okay, so from platform height. So our recommendation is sort of a soft 11 feet. Soft in the sense that we don't have a strong sense of it should be 10. We think 12 is too much. Is that everybody
Agree.
shaking their head?
Yeah.
And we don't think you need to make a minimum height.
Yeah.
Anything else on the roof construction? It says here you can use plywood that's painted. That brings us to the discussions we had earlier about whether we're trying to regulate the aesthetics to that level. And I think our feeling was no, just let merchants do what they thought was best for their business. But
Yeah,
painted plywood looks
as you
very
build a
cheap.
prototype, there should be some options to change surface materials.
But we did have a strong statement that tent-like vinyl structures are strictly prohibited. I think that should remain, just to be clear. It's very easy just to buy one of those online. And those really don't work.
Wondering about drainage because they have proposing roof drainage, gutters, leaders, etc. It affects the facade, it affects if you didn't have that, would you have an overhanging roof? Would that be allowed at 10, 11 feet?
Well, should a drainage system be required?
Should it be
Gutters and
required?
downspouts? Right, what is the standard now? It just has to be sloped towards the street, right?
It requires gutters and leaders.
It does require that.
Mhm.
Doesn't need to require.
Doesn't need to.
Right.
Yeah, so does it need to?
If you have the roof overhanging.
If you don't have it, your patrons are going to be very uncomfortable on a rainy, windy day. But that's not, maybe not, we're not trying to regulate that.
Yeah,
we
with
have-
the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Do you have any requirement on how far the overhang can be? Is it
There is,
regulated?
I think 6-inch is what I remember.
Oh, yeah, it says that the roof's outer edges, and this is on packet page 32, along the travel lane may extend 6 inches beyond parklet footprint at 8 feet or above.
So it says 6 inches, is that a maximum overhang or?
Maximum, I believe, is what it's trying to imply. I don't know if it says that.
Wouldn't it make sense again, just to leave the roof overhang has to fall within the envelope that's allowed for the parklet? You can't let the roof overhang extend beyond that, can you?
Well,
Yeah, it's allowing 6 inches into that 2-foot.
I see, okay, so,
Yeah,
okay, so you could have more than 6 inches if you brought your enclosure walls back.
is
Well,
that true?
I'm asking, is that
It's going to be a prototype typical dimension of some
Well,
sort.
but these standards are for people who want to not do the prototype also. This is just the overall standard.
Well,
That's
then
why I
they-
said we'll get to the kit
they're-
of parts.
They're going to bring in the design.
Yeah, but
It's
if I were designing
entirely-
this, I might want a 12-inch overhang, and I might be willing to talk my client into a greater, smaller footprint in order to have a bigger roof overhang. So I think 6 inches should be the maximum projection into that enclosed area.
Yes,
But don't
May
specify
ex-
that the roof overhang has to be 6 inches.
It says may extend 6 inches beyond. Probably should clarify with maximum into the beyond parklet footprint at 8 feet or above to allow for attachment of rain leaders and gutters only. So when it says to allow for attachment of rain leaders and gutters, does that mean that rain leaders in item 6, actually, it says gutters and rain leaders are required. Why are they required? If they can just, these are small little enclosures they can shed to the street.
I think so too.
It's true. There's no harm in letting the water drip on the pavement.
I'll take note of it.
Thank you.
I think if gutters are required, they should be within that 6-inch space. The way it's phrased,
Yeah.
you might think you can let the gutter project beyond that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Any other questions on the roof design and construction? Any question about the material of the roof or anything like that?
I would make one argument here. I think that we as the ARB are tasked with making sure that our city remains beautiful and materially cohesive. And we've been pretty clear about standards and materials in every other project we've reviewed. And I think that setting the standard for no vinyl roofs in terms of like the loose fabric-y type vinyl. And I think that exposed plywood is just not going to cut it. I think that painted plywood is not good enough and that should also be restricted. Beyond that, if they want to do corrugated plastic, corrugated metal, they want to do, standing seam metal, louvers. I also, it's sort of a little sidebar, but I also think that there should be the allowance for operable louvers, right? There's these prefabricated items that the louvers can open and close, and then all the wording that says open or closed. I think we just need to have an asterisk saying or operable, right?
Roof?
Yeah, they have a prefabricated trellises that the louvers actually open or they fully close. And it's something you can just literally buy as an item and install it, and it's all calced out and ready to go. So I think we should just allow for that possibility. But I do not think plywood should be allowed.
Okay, what do we think about that some sort of material restriction for aesthetic reasons, like painted plywood?
So are we only like excluding plywood, and what about MDF or a variety of other sheet wood material?
What if it's knotty pine boards that are painted?
We sort of get into the whole kind of material that's used within this thing, structure to roof. There should be some form of coordination. It seems that right now, the question is, will it be wood columns and structure of some sort, wood structure, or will it be a metal structure? I think my own preference is for a metal one and then a corrugated roofing of some sort. Looks more appropriate to me than a wood structure in the street front.
I vividly recall going down this rabbit hole last time we got into then paint colors. All of it starts to come on it. And what color paint is appropriate for these? And okay, we had a description of 3 or 4 matte colors, and then Elizabeth Thompson, when she was on the board, said, no, I want bright colors. And
Yeah.
who are we to tell a restaurant what the color schemes they should use?
Mhm.
So that's where we ended up just backing off, and maybe we had a statement that had to be somehow working with the style of the building or the restaurant, but that's impossible to enforce.
Impossible.
Yeah. So in the end, I think we just said there's not a whole lot of parklets that are that ugly, except the ones made with the vinyl tents. It's not a problem.
Mhm.
And so that's where we ended up, Kendra, just sort of saying, let's not regulate that.
Well, somebody
Sure.
makes the decision, right?
Right. I mean,
Along the
under-
way, if it's a prefab piece, then it's really.
The prefab ones, we should put our fingerprint on the style and make sure it looks good.
Mhm.
But if some guy just wants to put a piece of plywood on top with 4 wood posts and paint it, get some engineer to stamp that it's laterally sufficient. That's where we were struggling because it looks pretty
Mhm.
bad.
Right.
But the
And
process of having that go back through an architecture review instead, how do you regulate that?
understood, but I think it's, as we're restricting the use of vinyl tents, we're restricting the use of fabric vinyl roof coverings, right? With sunshades are sort of, usually made of canvas, they're a little bit more attractive. And I just, I'm not gonna die on this hill here. So if everyone else thinks that painted plywood can look nice enough, then I'm not gonna fight this too hard.
Well-
But I personally just think it's a level below the standard we should require.
It is. How do you define it?
I think we should be just determining or trying to determine what we would like to see for the prototype. That's where we start with. Individuals can do their own design later on and get it approved. But why should we be specific about that now? Or why should we mix up the possibilities here? The prototype is the one that's hopefully going to be predominant in the city.
I don't know about that because the prototype, based on how it's designed and stuff, might be more expensive than a small restaurant might be able to purchase, and therefore they might do the plywood and 4 posts, and getting an engineer stamp may be easier than buying the prototype. It depends, I think it's there are too many variables to say one way or the other. As far as roofing material is concerned, I'm kind of stepping back to say, is this trying to regulate solid roofs, in which case you wouldn't just have a plywood sheeting roof on a house that's going to drip, right? So would you have that in a restaurant facility, which is going to start dripping as well? So are we regulating that it is water, it sheds water versus sieves water through, in which case then it's metal or polycarbonate, or all of those would be the right
Much
material.
better. Yeah.
So are we regulating function or look, or both?
Well, both, it seems like, but the function, I guess you could just leave it up to the building code again. There are detailed codes about roof materials,
Right.
how they're waterproof and stuff, but I would bet plywood with a certain kind of paint would meet that standard. I don't think there's a
Epoxy.
code requirement that you have to have drainage. There's requirements about site drainage, but you can design a building without a gutter.
Yes, there's just minimum slopes to let the water out.
You have to get the water off the roof.
Right.
But I don't see why that wouldn't apply to the parklets as well. You can't let water stand there. Why not just say well, but then to Board Member Rosenzweig's comment, I mean, you might want a trellis type structure or louvers. That makes a lot of sense. So if you say it has to be a roofing material, that means it has to be water resistant, waterproof.
Perhaps it's more of, if it's a solid roof, then it should be water resistant material.
Should be any
Right.
material approved by code.
Okay.
I am not in agreement.
You're not in agreement.
No,
In what regard, David?
I really think we should make some recommendations that become kind of an important use issue here, that we have a drainage system with a sculpted perforated metal, not perforated metal, but what do you call it?
Corrugated.
Almost like a standing seam, but it might be,
Corrugated or standing.
but a pressed.
Well, we can do that
roofing.
for the prototype. We can say that's what this
That-
prototype requires that.
Yeah, we could say that the prototype should have something like that, and it should really be a sort of a steel structure that holds it up.
But we're talking here, David, about an overall standard,
Mhm.
not just a prototype. And for an overall standard, is drainage mandatory?
It's up.
Are
Well,
you
yeah,
just said you're in
drainage.
disagreement.
Yeah, no, drainage is going to be necessary.
So roof drainage systems,
Mhm.
even though it's not required in other buildings in the code.
Where is it not required?
Well, the
If you
code,
have a structure in the street, shouldn't have drainage.
not,
It's going to stay there all year long.
Well, no, but like houses don't necessarily have to have rainwater leaders and gutters. They don't have to. It's sort of,
They have to have drainage from the roof everywhere.
for example, when you have barrel tile roofs, the terracotta clay tile, you don't necessarily have to have a gutter. Those can just drain off on their own.
Oh, that's fine.
Right,
Yes,
but
you-
I'd expect to
you
ever
say-
see a parklet with a terracotta tile roof.
No.
I just, I don't necessarily think, like, imagine you did have one of those plastic corrugated sheets, right? It will naturally create these little riverlets off the roof and it will drip off the edge with or without a gutter.
I don't,
So,
I'm not suggesting gutters are required.
okay, understood. I thought you were. Apologies.
Let's move on to what I wrote, technical stuff, but heaters, light,
sorry,
yes, go ahead.
I just want to note a quick time check. So we're at about 10:40. I'm wondering, we do have one other item after this. So I'm not sure how much longer we want to spend on this and if we should order lunch.
I think, again, we'll spend about 15 minutes more. We'll aim to get the other one going at about 11, and I was hoping not to spend my lunchtime at City Hall. My colleagues would like lunch, speak up.
I'd like to get to my other meetings.
So
right, thanks.
if you want to order lunch for us and the staff, you can do that and just put us down as zeros.
Okay.
We have requirements regarding heaters, gas or propane. Any comments on that?
I'm all for not having propane, but this is basically the way it's written is makes it just about impossible to
Yeah,
have
so you
propane.
basically reached that goal.
Yes.
Yes,
So,
I agree.
I think the merchants will not be happy with that, but
No.
in the end, we felt that was the right thing to do.
Mhm.
On the lighting standards, there was saying string lights are allowed. How about any requirements, thoughts, ideas on that?
Personally, think they should have access to as much lighting as they're, capable of having. So if they want to install a little chandelier out there and they've run the hard wire and they've upgraded their electrical panel, they have every right to do so. I don't think it should be restricted to string lighting. They should, follow electrical items and then install what they want.
A caveat to that is because this is it's like a annual permitted space, right, on public property. How much permanent structure should they be putting in?
I just think the lighting should be as permanent as the roof structure above it.
Yeah.
So
Right.
what it says here is the following lights are permitted: string lights or solar powered or battery powered table lights. That means you can't have a series of permanent lights in the underside of the roof,
Well, you could have string lights and battery powered.
but you could have some
Table
lighting on the
lights.
table.
Mhm.
So basically restricting the use of lights. You think that's too restrictive?
I do. I think that's too restrictive. And again, I'm going to keep circling back to this and I apologize. Some of these prefab things have built-in lighting. That should not be prohibited. That would be
Yeah.
silly. And I remember where there was a parklet in downtown and they had these beautiful little chandeliers that they had sort of brought their electrical over. And I guess it was just, they were plug-in, right? There was nothing fancy. They weren't permanently installed, but they had these beautiful little chandeliers and a big power strip and they were sort of plugged into the power strip. But it created a really nice ambiance. And I think that if that's something that they can pull off, who are we to restrict that?
I would think,
I was just going to say that the following page, page 40, does kind of outline some more standards on lighting. And if permanent lighting is desired, they can follow the appropriate permitting for them.
so are we just reading too much into the way the preliminary wording is in this code, perhaps?
Pardon me?
Are we reading too much into the way this is written? When you list only two things are permitted,
Yes.
so I would comment that I think any kind of lighting that's allowed by code should be permitted, with the exception of if there's a traffic safety issue, if it's a bright spotlight into driver's eyes or something like that. And I would hope that that would get reviewed at some point. But otherwise, just let it go. And I would avoid trying to have statements in here about maximum wattage or color temperature. You just make the approval process so much more complicated. And we're not trying to get that detailed on that, I don't think. How about the use of amplified sound in television sets in these parklets?
They're not permitted.
Not permitted whatsoever. So the guy who runs Tehran Restaurant does a Monday afternoon guitar thing in his parklet, which is a wonderful feature, but he uses a microphone. Is that not permitted?
I don't believe, under the standards, I don't believe so. I think like street, s- um, as associated with the parklet not permitted, there may still be kind of street performers or that go through the typical channels that aren't associated with the parklet.
Someone could always get a use permit for a
Yeah.
street concert or a
Yeah.
Super Bowl display.
Correct, yeah.
Seems reasonable.
Yeah.
Um,
Going back on the wattage of lights versus the lumens and all of that, I agree with you that limiting wattage of each fixture may be overkill, but what about kind of the, typical any building project, you would go through a permit process for lighting, the energy usage and Title 24 and all of that. Is any of that required for a parklet and the lighting for it?
it says it has to meet the electric code.
So is it as a standalone thing, not as part of extension to the business? Right,
Well, egress is certainly very easy,
Right.
so there's no problem with egress.
yeah, not in terms of egress lighting, but like how much power usage is allowed in that square footage based on Title 24, is that going to be required for the parklet?
I don't think it's required. We can circle back. I think what is permitted alongside the parklet permit is just that single kind of
Right.
wire that is connected to the outlet on the building. If a parklet were to undergo a electrical permit separately, then it would have to undergo that separate process.
Okay, I guess that's when they would have the limitations defined.
I do want to note that I was noticing in the reports that the color temperature and kelvins and stuff of the lighting generally aligns with what we're thinking about for the dark skies ordinance that we'll be discussing after this. And so it is we want to probably try and align that however it comes forward on these, so.
Thank you.
Why don't we move into a final piece on, well, someone had asked a question about furniture. I'm sorry. What level of requirements do we have regarding site furnishings for these parklets? Was that you, Board Member Hirsch, who was concerned about that?
Yeah, they just mentioned sort of durable high-end quality furniture. I don't think that's quite enough. But plastics, kind of cheap plastics ought to be eliminated somehow.
Staff, do we have any regulations regarding furniture for restaurants in general? Say a restaurant is a private outdoor patio. Is there a requirement what kind of site furnishings they can use?
On private property or in public right of way?
Private property, but
On private property, we just have the architectural review guidelines. And so we want to, when we're looking at a plan set, if they're proposing a new outdoor, we're generally looking at like what they're proposing. If it's not that visible to the public, we don't care quite as much what they're using for their materials, for their seating. If it's visible to the public, we want consistency generally, but we might not have specific requirements. We do have kind of stricter requirements. Again, still just reflective of the architectural review, not so much written into the code on materiality for things in the public right of way, just durability and not cheap plastic kind of things.
Right.
I just have a hard time regulating, telling a restaurant what kind of chairs they have to use. I mean, it's a tough enough business as it is, and they're pretty focused on what their clients want. To tell them they have to use a certain Herman Miller chair that's $100 each. Might just drive them out of business too. So I do not favor any requirements on site furnishings. Any other?
Yeah, it's hard to define what is cheap plastic, right? They're pretty nice IKEA chairs that restaurants might want to use, and it's pretty cheap, but
I have
So I think
plastic
it's,
chairs in my house. Yeah, I like them.
yeah, so I
but-
think it's
But
hard to
they're
regulate.
quality,
Yeah.
really high quality
Yeah.
chairs.
It's hard to regulate and also seems unnecessary to regulate.
Yeah, and I would argue that the public will speak for themselves. If they don't like the chairs, they won't go sit there. And then the restaurant will lose business and that will sort of solve itself. So,
Yeah, I don't think furnishings. What concerns me actually is that somehow if this prototype, once again, has the possibility of somebody doing more to it than simply accepting the structure that's on the ceiling, if they wanted to sort of attach something to the structure itself, how do they do that unless it's planned for in some sense in the very beginning as a prototype?
Like banners or what are you concerned about?
Maybe
attaching?
a more solid ceiling if they wanted something like that, that was under the structure of it and the waterproofing of it, that it had a plywood ceiling that's colored, painted in some way to. How do they do that? Is there ought to be some consideration for a tenant wanting to, their own structure to look a little different than somebody else's. So they could put in a ceiling, a drop ceiling in it somehow to attach to it.
So let's come up with that as we go through the discussion of kit of parts then, and what flexibility do you have within each part? I notice on page 18, the recommended approach for the prototype design, there's 5 components to it listed: platform, flooring, enclosure, sidewalls, post, and roof. I propose that we consider actually 3 elements to the prototypes. One would be the platform and the flooring. Second would be the enclosure and the sidewalls, and the third is the roof. I think the idea of a kit of parts is very good. That would be really a good way for people to use it. But I think the kit of parts really should be a couple of options in each one of these categories. For the platform and flooring, there's 2 or 3, maybe 1 steel structure, 1 wood structure. And for things like the surface, it could be any number of materials, and they could all be part of one prototype. You don't have to specify that level of detail. Any one of those will meet the code and be fine. But the same thing would apply for the enclosure. You could have 1 with planters, 1 with a steel railing, 1 with a solid railing, for example. And then on the roof as well, you could have, say, a metal design like Dave Hirsch is talking about. I'm sorry, Board Member Hirsch, with steel posts and welded braces and a corrugated metal roof, maybe 1 with just a wood structure. And let people mix and match completely. A set of drawings might even include all 3, and you just put an X through the one you're not using. That would be an easy plan check process. They're simple parts, and just for the kit of parts, don't try to put together 3 assemblies as a complete package. Let them be completely choosing from these 3 parts. That's my opinion on it.
Yeah.
Who else wants to chime in?
I would love to chime in on this. So I had a lot of struggle earlier this week when we were reviewing the concept of prototypes versus kit of parts. I'm kind of like, what's the difference, right? Why have these 3 prototypes at all? And over the course of today's meeting, I've come to sort of understand that maybe the concept of these 3 prototypes is you buy that, not buy that package, but you buy into that package as is, very minimal changes. We're talking colors, furnishings, maybe some lighting, that's it. And it's pre-approved, right? You're ready to go. The question is, with the kit of parts, is that just an expedited review, or are all of those individual items pre-approved? And the reason that I want a sort of clarification on this is because I agree that I think everybody's going to want to have their own unique signature and stamp on it. And I think by providing a kit of parts, I'm going to borrow Board Member Balte's analogy that he had used earlier this week on this, is that it's like ordering a car, right? You choose your make, you choose your model, and then it's sort of, what color do you want? You have 4 options. What seating do you want? You have 4 options, right? Whatever that is. And building this kit of parts in that way, they can literally go down a checklist and say platform A or B, check. For your flooring, we've got these 6 or 8 or whatever that are pre-approved, ready to go, check, and they move along. Your railing type, A, B, C, D, these are your welds for it. This is how you connect it, check. And just really sort of doing it in that guideline. They want a roof? Yes. Okay, there's a couple subsets. They don't want a roof? Done, move along. And making it sort of that easy and efficient, I think, is worthwhile. And I guess the question that remains is, is it worth having these pre-designed modular components if we can get a kit of parts that's really hyper efficient? Right? So what's sort of the trade-off there? What would be the difference between the two processes? And is it worth focusing energy on a modular set that probably most people are going to want to modify to some extent? Or is it better to just really focus on a solid kit of parts, pre-approved, everything is just check boxes and you can move along. And then people can really mix and match as they want.
That's definitely how the Beverly Hills program is designed, like a kit of parts that is interchangeable and they're each approved and you can really kind of combine them in any number of ways. And I think that, we're here to seek your guidance. And if you have a recommendation on which kind of route to go, we would love to hear it. I think the intention with the kit of parts and any way that we do it is that it is pre-approved and wouldn't have to go through a subsequent approval.
Other comments on this? What Board Member Rosenberg just elaborated on?
Just to kind of add on to that in terms of the kit of parts, like let's say we have a metal or a wood option for the platform, the roof attachment to that might be related to it, right? If you want a metal roof and metal structure, you probably have to get the metal platform for all the attachments to make it simpler. Maybe not, but I mean, like, I'm also don't want to make it so onerous on the city to come up with, 12 different combination of the main structural pieces. The enclosure planter, hopefully we get some, those are not like structurally a major item, so they can add on. And I don't know if you even want to specify, I don't think it's necessary other than height limits on types of plants that can go in it. So there are parts to it that are not structurally, critical to fall into one bucket or another, but kind of simplify for the city. If you choose this platform, this is your roof option to go with it. If you choose this platform, this is your roof option to go. Maybe there are toggles within those two, but it kind of will fall in their own lanes based on what you choose. So that it might help simplify, but I agree that having prototype with all the, components set seems unnecessary and may not actually help the businesses.
I think a platform could be designed to be strong enough to support a roof or planters or anything. Just de facto, all the platforms are strong enough that you can bolt on a fitting for a wood or steel post. Just keep it simple. You tell the engineer doing this that that's the design standard. It's going to be a few more support pieces at the corners. Do it everywhere. That way they can come back later and add to it. That's not a big cost, design or structure wise.
And actually on that note, I think that's really beneficial in terms of if there's a change of ownership, right? Somebody has a parklet, the ownership changes. Now the new tenant doesn't necessarily need to start from scratch, which is kind of nice that those are all pre-approved, set, ready to go.
And the building department has confidence that it's strong enough. They approved it to begin with.
Yeah.
So if you keep that sort of mindset, just keep it so these are really interchangeable pieces without further restriction. Board Member Chen, do you have any comments on the kit of parts idea?
No additional comments, but just mix and match. I think it's really efficient and straightforward way to go.
Board Member Hirsch?
I think it's fine. I think fine, what we stated.
Before we close, can you put again that screen where you had questions? I want to be sure we answered all your questions. And then I think we're done with this topic.
Hold on one second.
Or if is there anything that we haven't addressed that you were hoping that we would?
Just wondering if we're going to be establishing an ad hoc committee? with it?
Yes, I think we will. I just want to. Okay, so well, we haven't discussed an outreach strategy. Is that something you want our input on?
If you had, I mean, we thought it's pretty comprehensive. What we want to make sure we stay connected with all of the restaurateurs and business owners, property owners. So we actually have a meeting scheduled next week. We'll have an opportunity for them to kind of understand how we're going to approach this and how it's going to benefit them. But if you have any input from us on the stakeholders themselves or on the timeline. We'd welcome that.
Thank you. I'll comment, the 3 photos you have of presumably parklets you think are attractive or desirable, right? All have planters with plants in them. It's funny, but it's actually not. These are really important.
Yeah.
Okay, let's form an ad hoc committee. Who wants to take this on? So I am interested in doing this. Who wants to join me on this committee? Kendra?
I would love to.
Thank
I
you.
just
So-
don't want to steal it from somebody else if they're.
No, I'd
interested.
like to do this when, I intend to actually speak to merchants myself, not part of your formal outreach, but informally. I dine out a lot around town and I really am interested to hear what they think. A lot of what I'm saying comes from conversations I've had. Okay, why don't we close out this topic, let's take a break until 5 after 11, 7-minute break. Is that okay? And we'll get going on. Thank you, everybody.
Where'd they put my
Started now, please.
Yeah.
Next item on our agenda is a study session to discuss the concepts of an ordinance to reduce light pollution and increase bird safety. Staff, do we have a report on this, please?
Yes, Kelly Cha is a new senior planner with our long range division. She'll be giving a presentation today, and we're just getting the presentation up for you.
Great. Hi, my name is Kelly Cha. I'm the project planner on the Dark Sky and Bird Safe Glass Design Ordinance. Next, please. This item is one of the City Council priorities from 2023. City Council directed staff to initiate an evaluation of strategies to protect natural habitats, including bird-safe glass and wildlife protection from light pollution. In addition, the comprehensive plan also has a policy on bird-friendly design. To come up with the staff considerations, staff worked with local advocates and reviewed ordinances from comparable cities. And this study session is aims to gather ARB feedback on staff consideration and offer an opportunity for the public to comment on these items as well. Next, please. So the term dark sky refers to movement and achievement of significant reduction of light pollution, as the light pollution could negatively impact humans and wildlife alike. Over the past few years or decade, awareness of dark sky has increased, and cities like Cupertino, Malibu, and Brisbane have adopted relevant regulations. Next, please. Palo Alto does not have ordinance on dark sky, but regulations related to lighting are in Palo Alto Municipal Code Section 18.40.250. And this is the summary of the code requirements right now. Next, please. Adding on to the ones we have in our code, staff is recommending some new requirements related to dark sky. Those are timing or curfew. Staff is considering requiring businesses and other homeowners to turn, well, not maybe homeowners, businesses turn off their lighting 2 hours after the business closure or 10 p.m., whichever is later, and also requiring motion sensor devices for lighting after the curfew. And of course, including some exceptions to emergency uses like healthcare facilities and some of the landscaping lighting as well. And another one is color temperature. I think you kind of looked at the parklet. They had some similar requirements. So we're requiring maximum color temperature of 2700 Kelvin, which is kind of considered warmer lighting, and also regulate brightness. And the maximum is 20,000 lumens, and also in total for a property would be 16,000 lumens. Next, please. And Palo Alto already has requirement for shielding, so we're continuing that, but also staff is considering reducing the light trespass requirement from 0.5 foot candles to 0.1 foot candle when it is adjacent to residential. And also there are some special purpose lighting, security lighting, outdoor recreational facilities lighting, service station lighting, and string lighting. Those are some of the things that we're considering, mostly continuing the same pattern, regulating the brightness and then just the timing and curfew. But there are some specific ones we're considering related to the uses and purpose. Next, please. The bird safe design. So we have, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's a comprehensive plan policy encouraging bird-friendly design and developing the guidelines for it. After reviewing neighboring cities like Menlo Park, Mountain View, Sunnyvale, San Francisco, and Cupertino, staff is currently considering design standards specific to glass treatment. And the current ordinance or current approach is largely based on Cupertino's ordinance. Next, please. So staff found, comparing all of those ordinances, that there were common standards, basically. So no more than 10% untreated glazing between ground level to 60 feet above ground. And there were some specific glazing types listed and requirements on avoiding funneling of flight paths and switchboards requirement after hours, reduction or prohibition of transparent glass use, and also reducing glass use at top of the building, especially when it has a green roof on top. Next, please. And these are some of the other standards staff found from other city ordinances. These are not as common. These are mostly found in San Francisco and Sunnyvale. They particularly have, I mean, these are not included. Currently, staff is not considering for Palo Alto, but it's presented here for ARB's information. San Francisco has the distance and location requirement, 300 feet from open space or any other open water, green rooftop, 2 acres or greater. So only those buildings that the standards only apply to those buildings. And for Sunnyvale, actually it applies to all of the buildings, but they have more stringent requirements if it is located within 300 feet of open water or water body, or immediately adjacent to some green spaces. And if for Sunnyvale, there are some reflective level requirements specific to those particular stringent for those who are located 300 feet or immediately next to. And also they have a requirement for architectural elements. Another thing that I wanted to point out was that San Francisco had a particular, this specific one where they only apply these bird safe design standards to single family only when that particular home has more than or 50% or more glazing on a facade. So I thought that might be something that ARB wanted to kind of consider. So those are some of the findings for bird safe. Next, please. Staff is, this is a study session item, so no action is required from the ARB, but staff is seeking ARB's feedback and input on staff considerations for dark skies and bird safe. Also providing an opportunity for public comment on this item. Staff will take the ARB's feedback and develop draft ordinances for both topics and present the draft ordinance to the Planning and Transportation Commission hearing in April and to City Council for adoption in May or June of this year. So this concludes staff presentation, and I'm ready to answer any questions and collect some feedback.
Thank you very much. Why don't we open to public comment next? So do we have any members of the public who wish to address us?
Yes, one from Shani Kleinhaus.
Good morning. If you could please state and spell your name for the record.
My name is Shani Kleinhaus. I am a resident of Palo Alto. I'm on Parks and Rec Commission. I do not speak for Park and Rec. And today I represent the Sierra Club and Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society. So if I go a little over time, hopefully you'll let me do that and speak for more than one organization. The Sierra Club and Audubon, we worked a lot with staff. We actually developed a model ordinance for dark sky, or actually for light pollution, because the light pollution affects also things that are not only in the sky. And we provided that to staff and also included it in a letter that we sent to you yesterday. I would like to talk about a few general scientific things. A new report just came out this week from the UN, shows that 1/5 of all migratory species are at risk of extinction. Half of the migratory species worldwide are have suffering population declines. We in this area are on the Pacific Flyway, which is a really critical place for birds in general and some other migratory species. Studies show that migratory birds are attracted to light. They get attracted even to light, to local buildings as well as to sky glow. and it confuses their migration patterns, and it exposes them to the hazards of the human environment, whether it's glass in buildings or cats or other hazards. And it's not only buildings and glass, it could be wires and other kind of structures that are hazardous to them. Light in general is pervasive, it's increasing worldwide, and it's implicated in as a driver of extinction, like climate change and other things that we speak about more often. It is one of the drivers of extinction of insects, which are the basics of the food chain for a lot of different species, because insects have really strong phototaxis. They're really coming to where the light is, birds as well. So in our letter, we asked you to look at ways to reduce existing light pollution. And the reason is we're already far beyond where we should be. We can't only look forward at how do we minimize the increases. We really have to look at strong reduction of the type of light pollution that we create currently. And other cities are doing it. There are two recent ordinances, Malibu, and the most recent one was just adopted this year in our neighbor Brisbane, a little north from here, that does look at two types of light pollution measures. One would be for the low-hanging fruits, buildings or lighting installations that can be adjusted, don't need to be replaced. You can just dim the light or do something that doesn't require a big effort. And they give them either immediately or 1 year to do that. The other one looks at more long-term and gives more time to change harmful installations. So and the letter shows that. The other thing was about including, that we wrote about, was asking you to include more than just glass. And I want to just do something kind of funny. Let's say I'm a bird and I have a big beak in front of my eyes. You don't see the same way. They don't see the way we focus. So we need to consider that they bump into things that are not exactly natural for us to bump into. Glass, we understand. We can walk through a window if we don't see the frame, but there's other things that are hazardous to birds. And, Sunnyvale has been looking at some bridges and wires and things. I want to be a resource to staff and to you. I've been part of the development of bird safety guidelines and standards in San Jose, in Sunnyvale, in Cupertino, other cities, Mountain View, other cities. If you have questions, feel free to call me back and speak to you. Thank you so much for the extra time.
Thank you for your comments and thank you for your continued efforts on behalf of the birds. Any other public speakers?
No, just one.
Okay, we'll bring it back to the board then for questions or comments. Let's just dive into this. I will start then. Where are these codes expected to apply in Palo Alto? Is it throughout the town or just specific areas?
Right now, I think throughout the town, citywide requirement, but we were also considering maybe having some different requirements for west of Foothill, maybe Baylands, but it's still in discussion.
Okay. Yeah, I think it would make sense to restrict some of these to areas that have specific needs as compared to, say, a downtown area or the residential neighborhoods, or at least different levels of regulation. What types of buildings or uses do these regulations apply to, or will they apply to?
We're also thinking about applying it to all types of buildings, so residential and non-residential, and also potentially public facilities, although that's in question. But we're here to kind of get your feedback on if you think that there are certain type of buildings that we should kind of limit or only apply to, then I'm more than happy to hear that from Aaron.
So again, I think it should not apply to single-family residences. I think this should not apply to single-family residences, but rather commercial buildings of a certain size. Okay, any other questions or comments from anybody else?
I have some.
We're doing both. We're not going to spend another 3 hours on this.
Okay, then I can blur my comments and questions. That's great. Starting with how it applies and who it applies to. in the section on implementation and compliance, it says at a minimum for new projects. But it seems like the city and public property within the city should be an exemplar for others. So if we can, apply it not just to new projects, but, look at how we can implement the limitations on existing buildings that are otherwise not about to get a permit within, as much as possible by this city. That's a thought and a recommendation. Because it's hugely important to do this. And so that, instead of just applying to future projects as the permit comes in, which can be a very long timeline to actually reach any goal. That's a thought. And then kind of related to that, on top of page 87, there are limitations on, total lighting load on a property should not exceed 160,000 lumens. That can be a half an acre property or a 50-acre property, right? So how are we quantifying what a property is and limiting the lumen level?
That's really good question. We have not actually worked through the size requirements, so we can definitely, if yours, I think that's a good idea to kind of look at the size of the property as well.
Yeah, like
right
lumens
now.
per acre or some way to kind of define it in a way that multiplies evenly.
Yep.
Or if there's even a range, if it's under a half an acre property, it doesn't apply, or some way to kind of make it so that, larger properties are not, adversely affected, that, they're limited to very low lumen levels if it's a large property, if they need it. Obviously, we want to minimize the light leak and uplighting for sure, but, at least also to make it fair for property owners. And kind of down a little bit into the weeds in the same vein is when you go to string lights allowed to emit no more than 300 lumens per string, that also should be more defined. Is it a 8-foot string or a 50-foot string, right? Or per foot of string, like some way to, again, be specific about what the ordinance is trying to limit. And I'm kind of seeing that in throughout, like for instance, on page 89, there's emit no more than 42 lumens on a string light. Is that per bulb, per string? Yeah, it's so I would just urge you to kind of drill down on being specific while also limiting how much light is allowed to leak. Regarding, should we focus on the dark skies first and then go to bird safety glass, or how would you like to? Because those are two separate interconnected topics.
Yeah, let's do it that way. Why don't you focus your comments now on dark sky issues?
That's it for now on the dark skies part.
Okay, to the extent that we can, let's focus on dark sky and we'll come back to the bird safety
Perfect.
issues.
All right. So I have some pretty strong opinions on the dark skies. While I understand the uses and I understand the benefits of this, especially to migratory patterns of birds, I think that it's really quite an overreach to force this on single family residences. There's too much variation. There's too much going on. That being said, I understand the need for this in some of the commercial style buildings, some of the taller buildings, some of the buildings that are made of predominantly glass, right? When you've got a 4-story building that's 85% glazing, it's very different than a 2-story single family home with no normal windows. So there's some of that. Now, what I will also say is that there are nearby towns that have some of the dark sky compliant exterior light fixture requirements. There are fixtures that are specifically designated as dark sky compliant, right? So if you're going to start talking about exterior light fixtures and you're talking about lumens and you're talking about lumens per acres, there's a very easy path forward to this is you just say that if you're going to be doing exterior light fixtures, they need to be dark sky compliant, period. And if you guys want to regulate how many fixtures per square footage of building, that makes some sense. But starting to calculate out lumens and kelvins and all this becomes a very tedious task when there's already a lot of the answers already there. So I would lean into that direction saying, okay, well, make sure that if you're going to do exterior fixtures, they're going to be dark sky compliant. You can regulate the number of them. Maybe it's per every linear foot of building facade, something like that. And again, I would restrict this predominantly to commercial buildings, maybe the industrial buildings as well, unless they have a specific need requirement. I'm thinking of the refuse station that needed to have these lights on all the time. And I would also try and focus these efforts more notably on the areas that really have more migratory bird paths, right? We are a very mixed city in regard that we have a dense suburban bordering on urban downtown. And then we also have the Palo Alto foothills that are very quite rural. And we have the Baylands, which really do need to be protected. And I would say the efforts really should be focused in the appropriate areas. And I'm not saying that birds don't exist in downtown suburbia, but let's start with the areas that need it the most. Baylands, foothills, right? And then that corridor in the middle where we already have a ton of light. I'm just not as fixated on adjusting those at this time. I think that we really need to focus the efforts appropriately. We have limited resources, we've got limited time. I know that there's a timeline for this and when it wants to get approved, right? And I think trying to tackle everything all at once is going to create a lot of chaos and problems. I think we really need to focus on the most urgent items, foothills, Baylands, and the more commercial and high intensity buildings. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Vice Chair Rosemary said we should probably differentiate different neighborhood like Foothill and Bayland are the priority areas that we need to focus on. And also I have a question or comment on packet page 89. So for the streamlined residential uses, it seems like the language here are more focused on the single family only, but how about the multifamilies? Like, then maybe we should, instead of using the word rear yard, maybe we could use like private open space or something like that.
So I think yes, the report kind of focuses on, it sounds like more focuses on single family because we do see them in single family homes, but it's not, it's supposed to apply to businesses. We sometimes see it outside, this when street closure happens and use the street area for those businesses. Sometimes we see them. And in multifamily development in open common areas, we also see them as well. So it's supposed to apply to everything, but if you think that there should be some limitations, I'm more than happy to hear that from you.
I don't have too much to add. It seemed, I do differ with my fellow board members here and think that there are different kinds of residences, some residences which have a huge amount of glass and would violate your regulations here. And I think that there should be some consideration of those areas that are part of this, whatever your final determinations are here. And in some way that should be enforced as well through the review process on private dwellings when they reach that level of, okay, so, but of course the Baylands and the foothills are of prime importance. That's where the birds are, so. I'm just reflecting a little bit on what we as a board have looked at in the past. I remember spending a lot of time on a commercial building at the Embarcadero, the end of our Embarcadero, with an automobile building in which there was parking on the roof of it for cars, and therefore lighting, et cetera. And we really spent a lot of time on that. So buildings like that are of also prime importance to, I think, to you to look at as well, to make sure that there are regulations that are enforceable for those kind of buildings. I find another aspect of this city is that it's sort of underlit on the streets. The street lighting is not going to be a problem here for lighting the sky, In fact, it's a bit dangerous to drive here at night sometimes. So we're in the right direction, I would guess, and hope that we just drive more carefully, that's all. I've sort of become aware of that personally. I live across from a creek, but frankly, I don't see any. Yes, no, that's really not true. There are quite a few birds in the area of my house. But it's dark enough so that the ducks that are in the creek itself, they don't seem to have a problem with it. They're more land birds anyhow. So we're not talking about birds, I understand, but lighting issues. So what my board member said, except for those facilities that we did talk about a building, new building with a lot of glass. And I would hope that the commercial buildings, I think that we are focused on that. And that the city should continue to be very focused on buildings with commercial buildings with a lot of glass.
I have a question related to that, if I may follow on that. The dark skies ordinance is strictly talking about exterior lighting, so not necessarily light leak from buildings through glass, right? So is that something that the city is trying to regulate? It doesn't read that way in
I
this
think
ordinance.
we don't have a very specific language there, but the intention is for indoor lights may be monitored with those switchboards. So after hours, I mean, after the business closes office hours, then it should be turned off. That's the assumption. And also if there's, and then that's why there's a curfew there. So it'll be, it'll be kind of applied to all of those indoor, outdoor lighting as well. But that's why we have added that provision that after 2 hours after the business hours, business closure, so that we don't interfere with their operation.
Okay, that's not how I read it. So
Okay,
it
so
might need clarification that the curfew hours and all of that in the dark skies portion of the ordinance reads like we're only talking about exterior lighting, not light leaking out of storefronts or businesses or what have you. So if that's what you're trying to regulate, that should be really clear.
Okay.
And to follow up on that, that regulation, if that does apply to interior lighting on a building, that has nothing to do with the amount of exterior glazing. Is that correct? That's just going to apply to whatever the function is of the building with no regard for the amount of glazing? Or is
For
it
the-
only over a certain percentage?
So for the dark sky portion, so we don't really talk about the glazing itself or just the lighting fixture, lighting, basically lumens brightness. So yes, that's correct. We don't really talk about the glazing portion of the building, but if that's something that we should definitely include and maybe consider, we can work on that.
Well, my 2 cents on this is I mean, there's 2 sort of portions to this dark sky. One is exterior lighting, right? And how that sort of affects the surroundings. The second portion is the glazing is directly tied to the illumination from the interior of the building. If you're going to go so far as to start regulating the inside of someone's building, how they function, how they operate, you better have a good reason to do it. Understanding that regulating the exterior of a building, that's impactful on everyone around them. Now, if there's a building that's like one of these old style downtown buildings that has small windows, I don't think that there's any need for that to be regulated and they should be allowed to do what they want. If you're going to have an all glass building, that is a different function and that light pollution from the interior to the exterior is different. So my concern here is that I do not feel super comfortable regulating the light timing emittance from the inside of a structure without having good cause. I think once you start going inside someone's building and affecting how they're operating and how they're doing things, you're crossing a pretty notable boundary. Exterior lighting is one thing, interior lighting is separate. So if you're going to cross that boundary, have a good reason to do it and have a good standard for when and how that's implemented.
On the reverse side, like building code in terms of occupancy sensors and, minimizing light, lighting usage outside of business hours is regulated by building code, at least as you get permits for new buildings. Older ones are what they are.
That's for energy efficiency,
Right.
not light emission.
It kind of, goes hand in hand.
Have an awful problem with the fact that we have, wintertime, it gets dark early, so that you have a hard time controlling the actual light that these buildings emit for such a large period of time during the year. Do you deal with that? Does that come up in your study of keeping dark skies?
Right. And
How
how
do you
does
deal
daylight,
with the fact that, in the wintertime, everything is
right. And
all
how does
the-
daylight savings
Mm.
time
Effect.
and switch impact this is, we could open that can of worms too.
I'd like to suggest to you that, based on what I've heard, Palo Alto really has two environmentally sensitive areas. One is the foothills, or I say west of 280 is how it's defined in the code, and the other is the Baylands. Fortunately, neither of those is extensively residentially developed. The Baylands has none. The foothills has an occasional high-end home going in there. Perhaps it's appropriate to say that all development, including residential in those areas, is subject to these regulations. But on residential stuff, I'd suggest that you stick to exterior dark sky permissible fixtures. That's the standard in other communities up and down the peninsula that are adjacent to the foothill area of Palo Alto, say Woodside, Los Altos Hills. And there's a pretty commonly understood way to regulate and apply that. It's an easy thing to enforce through the review process. Fixtures are, as Board Member Rosenberg said, just clearly labeled as dark sky compatible. And that makes it a very easy regulatory element to put in there. I suggest secondarily on commercial buildings, just a control system of some kind is often the easiest and best way to control this. 2 hours after opening or closing, but as long as the buildings have a system that's capable of doing that, which most modern buildings do, and it can be retrofitted to older buildings even, you'll achieve 80% of this goal with a very easy thing to do, regulate and enforce. So again, if even on commercial buildings, you strictly shoot for light controls, which would be actual luminaire controls, switches, turning them on and off, or you can use interior window shades too to prevent light emission. Those are both techniques that the ARB has used repeatedly and successfully on commercial buildings when you had issues of light pollution or light impacting the neighborhood from privacy impacts. And I suggest you focus on those things as well. So again, residential buildings, perhaps in the foothills area, you can regulate through dark sky fixtures. I'm just going to call out to you, though, that the way this is written, this is a whole level of additional regulation. As an architect, I'm looking at this thinking, well, that's another $5,000 for us to design. As plan checkers, you're saying it's another round of review and comments because it's complicated. And we're trying to make it easier to build buildings here in California, to make more housing available. This is the exact opposite of that. We're just adding another complex layer of regulation. What are we thinking? I mean, this is crazy. Let's try to, if we can get a big chunk of this just with better control systems, that's a condition of approval kind of thing. For residences, it's just a simple dark sky fixture. That's pretty easy. We're not perfect, but we're getting closer. And we're not adding an enormous layer of regulation, which is what this would do as it is here. So that's my thoughts on the lighting side of this. Can we shift to the bird safety glazing? Who wants to start with that?
One minor thing on the dark skies. One I saw from other cities as well, and here, if we're going to regulate the color temperature at 2,700, there's one mention of 2,200. Is there a good reason to do that? That's very, very warm and doesn't really match other cities.
It's very hard to find fixtures
Right,
at that
yeah.
temperature.
20, I think the goal of that particular Kelvin measurement was to make sure that we have readily available light fixture, light bulbs, whatever, for any consumers to obtain. I think 2,700 was the warmest level that any consumer can actually purchase. I think that readily available. So that's why we have chosen 2,700 instead of 22 or 3,000, which was, I think, recommendation from Dark Sky organization.
There's just a note here that says staff also suggests encouraging and possibly requiring in more sensitive area luminaires at below 2,200 Kelvin for better nighttime.
Yeah, so for those like more like foothills or baylands, which are more sensitive, we were thinking about maybe lowering that Kelvin level to 22, but that's also in kind of question at this moment.
But you're saying at 22 is hard,
College Park
2200 is harder to come by, and so it
Yes.
might not be.
Yeah.
Okay.
So 27 might
yeah.
be better.
And do you understand the difficulty of enforcing that kind of regulation? How complicated it is for a design team to put together the color temperature of every fixture at the early stages when you're doing this, and how difficult it is for building inspectors to actually check this? And what do you do when people change light fixtures then? Okay, bird safe glazing.
Yep. I can start on bird safe glazing, some comments. So I'm looking at page 90. So a few questions / comments. So when it says facades of all projects subject to bird safe development requirement shall be, so projects subject to bird safe development, how do you define that? And then further down in the no more than 10% of surface of the facade be untreated glass. And definition of untreated glass is not clear. So as we go down into like standard compliance, there's definitions of, mullions and all of that. It seems very vague what you're trying to regulate, and also how you're suggesting to comply are both a little vague. So any thoughts and comments on that? And I'll just add one more. The glass treatment must have high color contrast with the glass to be applied on the outermost surface. So like, insulated glass, that would be number one surface. Usually you don't do film or frit or anything on the number one surface, the outermost surface. So that seems like not really achievable with standard insulated glazing and fabrication.
I think I'm not 100% certain, but for that last comment on the outermost one, I think there was some study that says if it is installed inside or interior, then it's not as effective. That's why it might have been, that provision might have been written in here. But if it is not feasible in architectural standpoint, I think we can definitely discuss and
I
find
would
a
say
better.
definitely look
Yeah.
into it. I've never installed any pattern on the outermost surface because it doesn't last.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I'm
And
also
then
gonna
back to my
jump-
question of what
sorry.
does bird safe development mean?
Sorry, where was that
On
particular language?
the upper half of page 90, facades of all projects subject to bird safe development requirements shall have, does that apply to all projects, or is this trying to say certain
I think that
projects?
applicability is kind of in question. We're kind of trying to work on that, but for now, with this recommendations, considerations, it would apply to everything, all the buildings, but obviously we would like to hear from ARB if that would be feasible and if we can modify that particular requirement.
Thank you. I will hold my other question.
Anybody else on bird safe glazing? Go ahead, Board Member Chen.
So one comment on the bird safe design, because Asma and I were on the ad hoc committee when we talking about the North Ventura master plan. So based on our study, we found out it's not only the bird safe glass, but also other materials should be included here, like all those highly reflective materials like metals, different kind of metals that could have bird hazard. So, and another thing on the packet page 90 about the alternative compliance method, it says the third party consultant. So is there any qualification requirement for that?
Sorry, could you repeat where you found that particular?
Packet page 90. At the very bottom, it says the alternative compliance method shall be peer reviewed by a third party consultant. So is there any requirement for the qualification of the third party? Who could be the third?
So it will be sort of like a technical consultant that we would have to hire for that particular project. Either city can hire on behalf, most likely the developer would have to hire somebody and provide a report City, sorry, most likely city would have to hire, and make sure that they can provide alternative ways to comply with and come up with some bird safe design elements different from the city requirements, if they're proposing that.
I hear your comment as we need to clarify what the qualifications of that third party consultant would need to be. Is that what you're also saying?
Well, yeah, I'm just not sure if there's like somebody from the city or no, I mean, somebody hired from the city, or is applicant that need to find somebody that is qualified to conduct the review.
Yeah, I think typically anytime we're getting a third party review, the city is the applicant pays us to hire somebody. So that we know that it's an independent third party.
Thank you for clarification.
I don't have too much to say. I'm just reading bird safe design requirements, and at the third one, which is not including skyways, walkways, balconies, freestanding walls, building corners made of untreated glass, transparent materials, any other design elements that are untreated through which trees, landscaping area. What a long and involved sentence that is. Sorry, but it would be good to try to keep the sentences a bit shorter and to the point, as I can't keep our discussions sometimes either.
That's tremendously restrictive, that long sentence, though.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, not a whole lot of buildings don't have one.
It is. It really is.
So just to clarify, it's not restricting walkways in general. It would be walkways that have glass, though.
Balconies, balconies are restricted.
Balconies would be restricted with glass on the exterior. So
Any
that
sort
might
of-
be something to,
What
if
this
you feel
doesn't
that's
say anything
overly
about, it just says
restrictive.
all projects shall not include balconies. Are you serious?
So you're right. It's the sentence should be more clear, but what it's saying is if you have balconies, walkways, those sort of things, it shouldn't have a clear glass and especially clear glass with planting on the other side. So, if you can imagine, we have a lot of rooftop spaces that might have glass along the exterior that we sometimes do, and then you have planting along the exterior too. That could be a concern.
So
I mean, you're going to need an inspector around in the evenings hours somehow to see where these problems really are in the city, otherwise a lot of them will just get away with it without any controls. And I don't know if you have a budget for that. I don't really have too much more to add here.
Yeah, I have a few comments here as well. One of the things that we're constantly sort of battling is the bird safe glazing is that it is an extra cost, that there's different methods, that the science is actually still changing, that the discoveries that they're figuring out are different, right? Whether it's surface applied or in the middle, right? And so we're going to start implementing all of these design guidelines without appropriate information. On that note, how common are bird strikes within the confines of Palo Alto? All right, I understand that bird strikes are a problem. I understand that migratory bird patterns are an issue. I'm not trying to diminish that, but I'm curious how much of a problem it is within our city boundaries. And are we applying a bunch of new rules, regulations, and restrictions to something that's not a huge issue here? And I don't have the answer for that. And that's where I'm sort of struggling here, is because we're trying to make a bunch of new rules, codes, and regulations based on an incomplete set of information and an incomplete set of data. I mean, I've lived here my entire life, from when it was an apricot orchard next to my house to now being much more suburbanized and much more developed. I've seen exactly 2 bird strikes in my entire life within the city of Palo Alto, right? More decades than I care to admit. And it's providing a lot of restrictions on people that are trying to develop the city. At the same time, we as a city are trying to develop, we're trying to increase our housing. We're trying to increase, we've got 6,000 plus housing units we need to get in the next several years. And at the same time, we're making it harder and harder and harder for everyone who's trying to develop in the city to actually do so. The trade-offs are not really adding up in my mind. So I'm having some significant reservations about this. If I'm just going to put my 2 cents out there, I think that if you are going to apply bird safe glazing, it should be second story and up. I think having bird safe glazing on the first floor is really restrictive to retail. It's really restrictive to office buildings, to entrances of buildings. If they want to apply it, great. If that's a design consideration, great. But I think first floor retail storefronts, and you even have noted here on package page 91, at this time recommends historic structures and first floor retail storefronts. I think that's appropriate. I think historic structures should be excluded from this. They should not have to have bird safe glazing, because historic structures typically aren't predominantly glass buildings anyway. I think this bird safe glazing should be much more focused on buildings that are predominantly glass. And maybe it's 50% and up, maybe it's 60% up. I don't know the exact number, but to restrict a building that's more than 50% solid is a little bit different. I think that single family homes should be absolutely excluded. There's no reason to have bird safe glazing on a single family home. I don't care how much glass is on there. It's a Title 24 compliant issue anyway. You're not going to have a Philip Johnson glass house here in Palo Alto. You can't get that built. So it's not an issue. It's a moot point. Let's move on. For the multifamily residential, this is one of the sticking points for me where you really have a trade-off. I understand commercial having bird safe glass. I understand single family homes not having bird safe glass. But these multifamily residential units, it's a really tough call. Right? You want people to live in a home that's comfortable, that's interesting, that you can look out the window and see the trees and see the birds. You put this bird safe fritted glass on there and they're just not going to have that. So how do you resolve that? Maybe it's the living spaces that have bird safe glass and the bedrooms don't, or vice versa. I don't know the answer. But that one in particular, I think it needs a lot more time and attention than we've given it at this point. So apologies for my bluntness. I'm trying to keep it short. That's my 2 cents at this time. Thanks very much.
I think related to that, though, it's having clarity on what is bird safe glass. In your section of standard compliance treatments, it doesn't just say fritted glass. It says list may include, but not limited to, permanent treatment such as opaque glass, which we don't want to have too much of in residential. But window muntins, that's almost every building has muntins. But does that mean like I have 10 foot by 12 foot glass, and if I put one muntins down the middle, it meets the code, and you can have highly reflective glass? That's not the intent, right? So having clarity on what complies, and exterior insect screens, exterior netting, special glass treatment such as frit to provide. I think I saw in one of the other examples of like the percentage of frit. So having just clarity on, you can have tiny dots and have a higher percentage of frit, and you actually don't see it when you're 10 feet away. It just looks like milky glass, right? So having ways to comply without being extremely onerous in terms of cost and visual and all of that, I think that's, it does make sense to have some kind of ordinance, particularly for taller buildings with more glass, but having clarity on what complies, because when you get into the alternative compliance method, if we're not clear on what is standard compliance method, then it doesn't make sense to go to alternate method right away, right? It's like having, is it 50% frit is good of whatever pattern, or is there like spacing limitations? Like what are all the ways that you can comply if there's a compliance route?
With the bus stop presentation we got a couple weeks back, there was a lot of clarity on that, whether it's 4x4 grid, whether it's vertical lines, horizontal lines, things like that. So it is nice to have sort of what those items are,
right?
But again, it's one of those, in what applications should these be applied? Where is it important? Where is it not important?
Yeah, whether it's second floor and higher, and buildings, each facade more than 25% glazing, some way to kind of have connect the dots of where this applies and it does not apply. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I share the comments of Board Member Rosenberg. And I think especially on residential uses, even multifamily, this is extremely onerous. I'm not aware of the windows I can order from any local window vendor I work with that I can just check the box bird safe glazing. I mean, this doesn't exist. It's something I have to specialize, buy separate glass for, or apply to the glass. And same comment. We're trying to increase housing production. Adding a requirement like this to anything residential just makes it much more difficult. And so I just don't see it. I think that, again, we should really focus on the areas where this is most important. In this case, I think, again, the Baylands, obviously. In the foothills, we have so little development there anyway, and it's mostly wild area, so it makes sense. And then in this case, commercial buildings, especially taller ones, anywhere in town, have a big impact. Again, as the ARB, we've come across this we had a building the other day on El Camino that had 2 stories with a green roof, and we were quite concerned about having bird-safe glazing on the 2nd floor because of the proximity to the green roof. But you might say, as Board Member Rosenberg suggested, any commercial building either in the Baylands or the foothills or over and above this 1st floor, something like that, would be a reasonable way to then say it has to have bird-safe glazing, and you can just put a standard of what that is. As Board Member Adcock keeps asking for, there must be someplace just a standard what that description is. I just beg you not to try to overdo this. I'd like to add one more comment, but I'd also like to ask Ms. Kleinhaus if she has any comments or thoughts on this, if she'd like to chime in. I'm not looking for you to try to persuade us otherwise, but we've had a bit of a wide-ranging discussion, and a lot of us are talking about residential uses or buildings downtown. Can you give us a quick statement on your thoughts about that? Just to my colleagues, she's been quite vocal and a lot of work on this in the town, and we appreciate that. So we want to hear your comments, please.
Regarding residential, most of the bird collisions are in residential neighborhoods in homes. That's just the studies show that homes in residential neighborhoods where there's trees, that's where the collisions occur. The estimates are at least 1 bird per year per house. So I'm not sure how many homes we have in Palo Alto, but that can give you an idea. In terms of aesthetics, which seems to be of a concern, I'm happy to show you some beautiful implementations. In terms of residential, there are requirements in Cupertino, there are some in other places, and some for multi-units. Mountain View has some of that. A lot of different ordinances exempt storefronts because, people want to see what's inside. And one other comments I'm thinking regarding lighting inside the building. Usually, if they turn it off after the building and there's a lot of actually regulation already, state regulation, so you can add to that a little bit. But the main problems we've seen are where people are using the inside of the building as an advertisement, like with some storage facilities where there is it looks like it's storage and it's lit all night and it's not really, it's just a painting inside the building, which is lit. So there is nuances that are not very easily to resolve. In terms of aesthetics, there's really some beautiful, beautiful installations. And all the big companies in the area are using them. Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Intuit, they all have various installations. Regarding what would make bird safe design and the cost, the way that there are so many opportunities that being too strict will say, well, why do I have that? There is also these other options. One option to look at is Mitchell Park Library, and at the top level, these structures are reflected in the glass. So there's so many things you can do that are not necessarily fritting or putting film, although that's pretty common. And in Cupertino, they do require for most homes that are within a certain distance from a creek or the foothills, et cetera, or park to install. And they've been doing it, and people are still building. Mountain View has a lot of requirements. That didn't stop development in Mountain View. So I think that assuming that this will be a huge hurdle, it's a little far-fetched, and I'm happy to provide more information or show you some. There is some beautiful, beautiful installations.
Thank you for your comments. Appreciate
Thank you for asking.
Anything else on this?
Yes, well, I have a lot of birds in my yard. And I'm about a block from, not even, across the street is the creek, San Francisco Creek, so San Francisco Creek. So I want to emphasize the residential areas as well. I know it's not going to be as easy to insist on it, so I think that all you have to do is get the catalogs, whatever is necessary to have it in the office all the time. If you are building in an area like where my house is.
You live adjacent to San Francisco Creek, that's Palo Alto Avenue. So the whole length of Palo Alto Avenue on one side is adjacent to the creek. And what other creeks are there in town? There's 3 or 4 of those large drainage channels, which are mostly now in concrete conduits. There's quite a few homes back up against that. So you're suggesting perhaps all of those properties that are within a certain distance of a creek?
Naturalized, lots of trees. I have.
Microphone.
You turn your mic.
Microphone.
Say that again. You're saying not necessarily.
Not necessarily a concrete area, but certainly something which a naturalized area, like
So-
the one I'm living in, lots and lots of trees, lots of birds.
So all development within a certain distance of a naturalized area. What are you going to say to that, board member Adcock?
What does that mean to be naturalized? If there's a tree next to that concrete culvert, is that naturalized?
Right, and we require street trees in Palo Alto, and trees need to be planted, and you have to have a certain amount of trees. And if you cut down a tree, then you have to replace it with 30 more trees. So now are you suddenly naturalized because you have 30 more trees because you cut down one tree? It becomes restrictive. I'm going to ask a sort of obnoxious question. I apologize in advance. How many bird strikes have you had on your house right next to the creek in the past 20 years you've lived there? Microphone.
I really have the appropriate glazing, not to attract the trees to come to it. There's one large door, but otherwise I have mullions in the glass, and I don't have fretting in the glass, but I do have mullions in the glass, or kind of a glazing that would not attract the birds.
Do you have non-reflective coating on your windows?
No,
Do you have any bird frit on your windows?
no.
So then my argument, and again, I'm not trying to be obnoxious here, but my argument is there are clearly ways that we can build houses, and I'm specifically focused on houses here, with other methods that are not bird-safe glazing with fritting and things like that, but there's absolutely ways to do it. And what those specifications are is little beyond today's meeting, but I have a really hard time buying off on this for single-family homes.
Well, I don't think there are a set of standards of design for bird-safe glazing aside from some of these materials from reflective glass. It's still being developed. It's a relatively new thing. My board member Hirsch is saying his house has sort of an angularity to it, and the windows are these steel frame with more grids in them. Sure, those are all things that help the situation, but how do you possibly regulate that? Make a rule that would apply to him, not somebody else? Okay, board member, tell us how, please. Ms. Kleinhaus again.
I live near Adobe Creek. It's a channelized creek, and we used to get bird collisions. We no longer get them because I retrofitted, not using those specific things, but I have visual cues for the birds on the windows, so they don't collide anymore. I think the problem that we're going into is that there is more and more very high percentage of glass on new buildings. And people like it and they want to feel outside, but it also is much more problematic. And if we're not going to limit how much glass can be on a surface, then we should limit the collision potential of that glass. That's my opinion. And I live in Palo Alto, and I used to have a lot of bird collisions, and it's a concrete channel, but I don't anymore because there are so many ways to do it. So, if you use something the birds can see, it doesn't have to be fritting. It's what I'm trying to say.
The question is, how do you regulate it? There's many
sorry?
ways I grant you, there's
So
many ways to do it, but how do you regulate it so the staff can actually enforce it?
The mullions have been used what staff recommends is pretty much boilerplate from what other cities have done. And staff looks at applications and looks at, and I got actually like some of the architects that are working on building homes in Cupertino calling me and say, well, what do I do about this?
Yeah, exactly.
So I recommended a few possibilities which were approved. Freighting was for homes is difficult for single homes. That's almost impossible, but they can put the mullions if the window is broken about, like almost a foot by foot, that's usually enough. If they some put film on the outside of the glass, there are bird safe film, like there are several companies that offer those. So some homes do that. Some do install these, I don't remember their names. They're like long, narrow line cables that you can do in different colors, and they kind of create this, it's like those hippie curtains. There's other people came up with their own creative solutions, but usually it's either screens or some sort of visual cue, like film for new buildings. For offices, there are a lot of different ways, but mostly they use freight. It's easier for them.
Thank you very much. Okay, colleagues, if I heard one regulation would be just to limit the size of a single pane of glass to 12 inches by 12 inches, which is what she just recommended. That's what they mean by mullions, I gather. But okay, Jody, how hard would it be to regulate homes to have no more than 12 inches by 12 inches of glass as you go through plan check?
We could certainly say that, all homes near naturalized creeks need to have windows, divided light windows. And we can review for that.
But instead of being as restrictive as divided light, can it be some kind of window treatment or a visual cue on the glazing that is at least every 12 inches on center? That's one thought. But the other is when it says avoid use of highly reflective glass or highly transparent glass, can that be also defined further? What is highly reflective, like solar reflective index of what, right? So if you're under a certain, if you're not hitting that reflectivity of the glass, then you have to do nothing, right? So can that, I'm just trying to get to a point where where does the regulation trigger start? And then what are the compliance methods to solve it? If just the type of glazing is not reflective enough to require you to do anything different, then there's nothing to do. That makes sense?
No, understood that we need some more refined definitions.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay, so we're going to, staff, have we given you ample or adequate feedback on this?
Yes, thank you. So I think that was very helpful, and I understand that we actually lacked some of those specifications. So it was really good to kind of go through with ARB to have that information came back to staff. So we'll definitely, I think there is a lot of work to do. So we'll probably have to go back and look at many different other cities and how they have done, and also kind of talk with them to find out what actually worked and what didn't work thus far after they have implemented those ordinances as well. So we can, so there's, I think, a lot of work to do before we can actually draft an ordinance. If you like, we can also come back, but with the draft ordinance language. And I understand that I think it's clear that residential might be some of the issues with the bird safe. And then we'll focus more on those specialized area like foothill and baylands, and think a little bit more about those the urbanized area in Palo Alto. So we can come back with those language, more specified language as well.
So just a couple clarifications. Right now, our schedule does not set out coming back to the ARB, and we do have a lot of projects planned in the next few months that are coming forward at the time that this might be ready. we can definitely explore internally that timeline again as we move forward and whether we need to try and accommodate. But we also kind of wanted to check in and see if you guys do want to assign an ad hoc committee to this. Yeah.
Okay, so you're asking me, no, I don't think we want to form an ad hoc committee on this. We already did it once and it didn't take us very far. So we sort of made an effort on it, unless Board Member Chen wants to do this again. No. But I do think that I would like the ARB to be able to give you an official opinion about the draft ordinance. So I would like to have it come back again. I would especially like that because I think we're not going to be too complimentary of it. I want to be sure that's in the record for council to see and hear from us. I think we've been pretty clear on big picture on this. So yes, I think this should come back to the ARB to the extent that you guys can fit it in your schedule, which I understand is busy. Unless my colleagues feel otherwise. Otherwise, what's left, what the city council hears otherwise is, yes, we brought this to the ARB and they gave us comments, and that's it. What those comments were, what the impact of it doesn't usually filter up in the process. I'd like to be able to stand in front of the council and speak to them about what our position was on this issue. So, yes, we would like it to come back to the ARB. Can we move on? We are done with our study sessions. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Next item is approval of minutes. This is minutes for November 6th, draft Architectural Review Board meeting minutes for November 16th. Do we have any comments or emotions on that, please?
Motion to approve.
Seconded.
Moved and seconded. With no comments, can we have a vote, please?
Board Member Adcock,
Yes.
Board Member Chen,
Yes.
Board Member Hirsch, Vice Chair Rosenberg,
Yes.
Chair Balte.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. Last item is board member questions, comments, and announcements. I would like to announce to my colleagues that I did attend the city council meeting earlier this week where they discussed, reviewed, and approved our SB 9 objective standards. They were complimentary of our work, and I wanted to pass that on to everybody.
Thank you for taking the time to do that and representing our board there.
Yes, it was a pleasure. Okay, with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.